Beneath the restless waters of the North Sea lies a silence that once carried voices, hearth fires, and the weight of forgotten journeys. Long before these waves carved their dominion, an immense plain stretched between the coastlines of Britain, Denmark, and the Low Countries. Rivers meandered across its fertile expanse, herds of animals roamed, and human communities built lives where now only shifting tides remain. This land, known today as Doggerland, vanished not in a single night of myth, but through the slow encroachment of ice melt, rising seas, and sudden floods that reshaped memory into absence. Yet the story of its erasure lingers, like a bruise upon Europe's deep prehistory. Fragments have returned to light, bones drawn from the nets of trawlers, flint tools dredged from the seabed, whispers of mammoths, aurochs, and men who once hunted across valleys now drowned. Each relic seems to breathe the presence of a civilization erased not by conquest, but by water. And with each fragment rises a question. What knowledge, what traditions, what truths slipped beneath the waves with them? Was it merely an accident of geology and time? Or was the forgetting itself convenient for powers that later shaped the story of Europe's past? Doggerland, Europe's Atlantis, does not present itself as fantasy, but as a wound concealed in plain sight. Its memory asks us what else has been lost, not only to nature's violence, but to the editing hand of history. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story begins with an unsettling dissonance between maps and memory, between the Europe we are taught to imagine and the Europe that truly was. Today, the North Sea is regarded as an inevitable, permanent expanse of cold gray water separating England from continental Europe. But in the sediments beneath those waves, in sonar scans of the seabed, lies the outline of a landmass that once connected what the sea now divides. This submerged territory, called Doggerland by modern researchers, forces us to reconsider the narrative of human prehistory in northern Europe. For thousands of years, it was not an ocean, but a plain, a place of rivers, forests, and marshes where life thrived. And yet, this vast landscape disappeared so completely that until recently, its very existence seemed almost inconceivable. What haunts this mystery is not simply that Doggerland was real, but that it lingered in obscurity for so long. Fishermen working the rough waters between Britain and Denmark have for centuries pulled up strange objects tangled in their nets, bones of long-extinct animals, antlers, fragments of human skulls, and tools carved from flint. To most, these were curiosities, sometimes kept, sometimes discarded. They hinted at something older than memory, older even than the myths. Yet only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did a concerted effort begin to map the seabed with modern technology, revealing valleys and hills, drowned river systems, and evidence of human habitation. What was once myth-like speculation hardened into scientific fact. There had been a lost land, and it had cradled generations of human life before it was swallowed by the sea. The disappearance of Doggerland was not abrupt in the way that Atlantis is imagined to have fallen in a single catastrophic night, but its loss was no less dramatic. As the last ice age receded around 10,000 years ago, glaciers melted and seas rose. Low-lying plains that had been home to Paleolithic and Mesolithic communities became vulnerable to encroaching waters. Coastal villages, once far inland, would have gradually found themselves closer and closer to the advancing shoreline. Floods turned familiar valleys into marshes, then into shallow lagoons, before they were finally consumed by the waves. Archaeologists suggest that the final blow may have been delivered around 8,200 years ago, when a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that surged across the region. That wave would have drowned entire landscapes, forcing survivors to flee to higher ground. But even as science reconstructs this event with sonar maps and carbon dating, questions remain. What stories did the people of Doggerland carry with them when the waters rose? Did they remember a homeland vanishing beneath the waves? Did those stories ripple outward, echoing through the mythologies of later cultures that spoke of floods, lost lands, and vanished ages? The flood myths that stretch from Mesopotamia to Scandinavia, from the biblical tale of Noah to the Norse accounts of drowned realms, seem to shimmer with a faint memory of places erased. Could Doggerland have been one of those sources? A real event woven into the symbolic fabric of human storytelling? The bones and artifacts retrieved from trawlers are quiet witnesses. A mammoth tusk pulled from the seabed suggests that this land was once alive with great beasts, creatures now long extinct. A shard of a harpoon carved from antler hints at hunters who stalked rivers and marshes. Pieces of human skull whisper of those who once thrived here, only to be displaced. These remnants are not just fragments of survival, they are fragments of meaning. They suggest that Doggerland was not merely a wilderness, but a place where communities adapted, where culture formed, where rituals perhaps honored the cycles of life and death beside rivers now buried underwater. And yet, the silence that surrounds Doggerland feels intentional, as if history itself has chosen not to remember. In the shaping of European identity, this drowned world is rarely invoked. Textbooks skip over it, preferring the simplicity of neat boundaries, Britain as an island, the North Sea as a natural separation, Europe as a continent defined by its coasts. But Doggerland disrupts that neatness. It suggests connection instead of separation. It suggests that what we now think of as nations and regions were once fluid, joined by land and by culture, not divided. Why, then, is this land not central to our understanding of European history? Why is it left to linger as a curiosity, spoken of only in specialized archaeological reports? Perhaps the answer lies in the way history is constructed. Narratives of civilization often emphasize permanence, continuity, the idea that modern nations are rooted in deep, unbroken soil. A land that vanished undermines that illusion. It reminds us that what feels eternal is fragile, that landscapes can change, that the ground beneath our feet is not forever. For empires and religions that depended on the notion of stability, such reminders were inconvenient, and so Doggerland remained buried, not only beneath the sea, but beneath the surface of cultural memory. There is also the haunting possibility that Doggerland was more than a geographic curiosity. It may have been a cradle of traditions and knowledge that never survived the flood. We cannot know what languages were spoken there, what songs were sung, what ideas were passed from elder to child. But the absence of these voices is itself a presence. it lingers as a question. What was lost when those plains sank? Were these communities simple foragers, or did they cultivate ways of life that influenced the cultures that followed? If fragments of their memory persisted, could they have fed into the myths of later Indo-European peoples, into the stories of drowned lands and forgotten golden ages? Standing at the edge of the North Sea today, watching the horizon blur into mist, one might feel the ghost of that forgotten land pressing against the imagination. Waves conceal its valleys and forests, but sonar has traced them, and dredgers have lifted pieces of its story from the darkness. The knowledge that Britain was once joined to Europe is no longer speculation. It is fact. Yet in that fact lies something more troubling. The realization that whole chapters of human history can vanish almost completely, leaving only scattered bones, broken tools, and shadows of memory. And so, the mystery of Doggerland is not only the mystery of what was there, but the mystery of why it was forgotten. Was its memory erased simply by time, or did later cultures find it useful to let it fade, to emphasize division over unity, to tell a story of islands and nations rather than shared plains and shared origins? The silence is heavy, as though the sea itself conspires in this forgetting. And yet with each artifact pulled from the deep, that silence cracks a little more. Perhaps the real question is not why Doggerland disappeared beneath the waves, but why its story disappeared from our consciousness. Was it nature alone that buried it, or something within us that preferred not to remember? The waters may never return what they took, but the very act of asking brings the forgotten land closer to the surface. In that asking lies the unsettling realization. What other lands, what other truths have slipped from history's grasp and now wait in silence beneath our feet or beneath our seas? The more one contemplates Doggerland, the more the line between myth and archaeology begins to blur. Flooded worlds are not merely the domain of poets and storytellers. They are inscribed in the seabed and the silt, waiting for human curiosity to rediscover them. Yet it is impossible to look upon this vanished land without hearing the faint resonance of myths that have haunted cultures across time, the tale of a world destroyed by rising waters, a land where people once lived and thrived, now gone. The echoes are uncanny. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a catastrophic flood that reshaped humanity's fate. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah preserves the same motif in sacred form. Norse traditions whisper of drowned lands and fates tied to the sea. Celtic myths recall realms swallowed whole beneath the waves, like Cantre'r Gwaelod in Welsh lore. Was Doggerland one of these echoes, a real memory that reverberated through oral traditions long after the land itself was lost? The flood that ended Doggerland's final chapters was not a singular event, but a series of encroachments. Yet the Storegga Slide tsunami, striking with devastating force, must have been a moment carved deep into collective memory. One can imagine the terror of water rushing in, overwhelming settlements that had survived countless generations. Families would have been displaced in a matter of hours, forced to abandon not just their homes, but the entire framework of their existence. To live through such an upheaval would leave scars that could only be carried in stories. And those stories, repeated across centuries, may have taken on the character of myth. A once great land, a home, erased beneath a merciless sea. Evidence of Doggerland has come to us piecemeal, drawn from the seabed not in a carefully controlled excavation, but through the accidental net of industry. Fishermen trawling for cod and plaice often found, instead, the remains of mammoths and rhinos, bones of red deer, and flint tools shaped by human hands. Offshore drilling for oil and gas in the late 20th century provided the seismic data that allowed scientists to map the drowned valleys, rivers, and ridges of Doggerland in astonishing detail. What they revealed was not some barren wasteland, but a rich and varied ecosystem, a place that could support large animals and, more importantly, human societies. The sediment preserved pollen, seeds, and traces of vegetation, showing that this drowned world was once lush and fertile. But what kind of people lived there? That question hovers like mist, tantalizing but evasive. Archaeologists describe them as Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people who fished, hunted, and gathered along the rivers and wetlands. Yet reducing them to the simple label of hunter-gatherers feels inadequate when standing at the edge of a vanished world. For these were communities that endured over millennia, adapting to changing climates, building lives, raising children, creating rituals that have long since vanished. In every artifact we find, a flint arrowhead, a harpoon tip, a fragment of antler, we glimpse not only survival but the thread of culture, the possibility of a world view now inaccessible to us. What did they believe when the waters came? Did they see it as punishment, as transformation, as inevitability? Doggerland was not small. Estimates suggest it once covered nearly 100,000 square miles, a landmass comparable in size to modern-day Great Britain. It stretched from the east coast of England to the Netherlands and Denmark, linking what are now separate nations into one continuous plain. Its rivers would have joined with the Thames and the Rhine, creating vast wetlands teeming with life. Its rolling hills and marshes provided both challenges and abundance. For the people who lived there, this was the center of the world. And yet, the sea claimed it all, forcing its inhabitants to scatter, to adapt elsewhere, to carry their culture into new lands. How much of Northern Europe's early cultural DNA was shaped by the scattering of Doggerland's survivors? The enigma deepens when one considers the way Doggerland complicates modern notions of borders and nations. Today, we imagine Britain as an island, a separate identity formed in part by its geographic isolation. Yet, in the deep past, it was not an island at all, but a peninsula of Europe, joined seamlessly by Doggerland. The idea of separation is therefore an illusion of recent history. For millennia, there was no channel, no sea, only a shared landscape. This realization unsettles the story of Europe as a place of neatly divided regions. It suggests instead a continuity that history has chosen not to emphasize. Was the forgetting of Doggerland's existence partly shaped by the desire to enforce later identities, of island and continent, of separation instead of unity? It is here that speculation begins to enter the realm of cultural memory. If Doggerland was known to those who lived after its disappearance, what became of its stories? Could the idea of a great lost land have been preserved in whispers, later to be absorbed into Celtic myths of drowned kingdoms or Germanic tales of lands swallowed by the sea? The uncanny repetition of flood narratives across cultures cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence. Geological events like the Storegga tsunami provide a natural explanation for the origins of such myths, grounding legend in real catastrophe. And yet, the persistence of these tales across the world hints at something more universal: humanity's awareness of vulnerability, of impermanence, of the fragility of all that we build. Doggerland is therefore not merely a scientific curiosity, but a mirror. It forces us to confront the instability of the landscapes we inhabit. The idea that an entire land could vanish, and that its memory could all but vanish with it, strikes at the heart of our assumptions about permanence. We like to believe our cities, our nations, our civilizations are eternal. But the drowned plain beneath the North Sea tells another story, one of inevitability, of change beyond control, of human lives rearranged by forces far larger than themselves. And perhaps this is why Doggerland lingers at the edges of consciousness, half remembered, half forgotten. It is easier to look away, to focus on histories that emphasize progress and continuity rather than rupture and loss. To acknowledge Doggerland fully is to accept that erasure is as much a part of history as endurance. It is to admit that much of the human story lies not in what we preserved, but in what we lost. The silence of Doggerland is therefore both accidental and deliberate. Nature covered it, but culture forgot it. And in that forgetting lies a question that lingers like a shadow across the North Sea. How many other lands, how many other stories have been erased? Not just by water or time, but by the choices of those who wrote the official versions of history. To look into Doggerland is to stare into that silence and to feel its weight pressing against our imagination. The sea may never return what it took, but it leaves us with fragments and questions, reminders that the past is never as solid as we wish it to be. Doggerland lies beneath the waves, but in its silence it forces us to consider. What if the histories we cling to are only partial, only fragments of a greater whole that remains submerged? What if the real Europe, the Europe that shaped us, is still hidden under the water, waiting to be remembered? If Doggerland's contours can now be traced through seismic scans and fragments lifted from the seabed, what remains less tangible are the human echoes, the lives once mapped across those plains. Archaeology speaks in fragments, but fragments are only the husks of what was once full and alive. To imagine Doggerland fully is to imagine a world of sounds, the call of birds over marshes, the laughter of children by the riverbanks, the scrape of flint against stone as tools were sharpened in the glow of firelight. Beneath the North Sea lies not merely a lost landscape, but the burial ground of memory itself, a place where entire ways of being were extinguished, yet linger faintly through what they left behind. The bones recovered from fishing nets are silent testimonies. A mammoth's tusk, dredged up from the darkness, hints at the abundance of an earlier age when massive creatures roamed the plains. A spear tip carved from red deer antler suggests hunters who tracked their prey with patience and ritual, passing skills down across generations. But what strikes most deeply is not the existence of these artifacts, but their displacement. The way they surface centuries later in the hands of modern people who cannot fully read their meaning. We see in them evidence of survival, but survival itself is not the whole story. What of ceremony, of myth, of the intimate relationship between land and people? When the land itself is erased, how much of that unseen inheritance vanishes with it? The pollen grains preserved in seabed sediments provide another whisper of Doggerland's life. They tell us of birch and pine, of grasslands and marshes, of shifting ecosystems adapting to the warming climate of the early Holocene. These details may appear scientific, clinical, detached. Yet if one imagines them not as data but as landscapes, the picture becomes vivid. Open plains where wild horses grazed, wetlands where reeds rustled in the wind, dense groves where firelight flickered against bark as communities gathered. In this picture, one can sense the richness of a world that sustained not just survival, but meaning. And then there is the flood. To modern minds, it is tempting to reduce it to a geological inevitability: ice sheets melting, seas rising, tectonic slides shifting. Yet for those who lived it, the flood was not geology. It was terror. Imagine watching the rivers swell beyond their banks, marshes becoming lakes, familiar paths vanishing underwater. Imagine the moment when land that had been walked for centuries disappeared within a single lifetime, forcing families to abandon the graves of their ancestors, the hunting grounds of their youth, the hearths of their memory. These were not abstractions, but ruptures in the heart of human existence. The trauma of such loss would not have faded easily. It would have echoed through stories and myths, through rituals meant to remember, through warnings whispered to children. Perhaps this is why flood myths feel so universal. Doggerland was not alone. Other coastal lands also drowned as seas rose worldwide. Yet in northern Europe, the drowning of such an expansive plain may have been especially searing. Later myths of submerged kingdoms, like Lioness in Cornish tradition or Cantre'r Gwaelod in Wales, mirror the motif of a once thriving land erased by the sea. Scholars argue whether these tales were invented much later, or whether they are folk memories of real events dimly remembered. But the pattern is undeniable. Where the sea has taken land, human imagination has left behind stories of loss. Doggerland's vanishing also poses another question. What role did it play in the migrations and cultural transformations of prehistoric Europe? When its inhabitants fled rising waters, where did they go? Some may have moved westward into what is now Britain, others eastward into the European mainland. If so, the memory of their lost homeland would have been carried with them, shaping the identities of communities far from the drowned plain itself. Could the spread of certain tool-making traditions, certain hunting practices, or even certain mythic motifs bear the imprint of Doggerland's refugees? Archaeology cannot prove it directly, but the possibility lingers like a shadow on the edges of Europe's deep past. The silence of Doggerland is especially striking when compared to other ancient landscapes. Consider the caves of southern France or Spain, where Paleolithic paintings still whisper across the millennia, offering us a glimpse into the minds of those who created them. Doggerland has left no caves, no paintings, no direct voice, only what the sea allows to surface. Its people remain voiceless, their cosmologies unknown. This absence feels almost deliberate, as though the sea itself conspired to keep their stories submerged. Yet absence itself becomes presence. In what we cannot know, we feel the weight of what has been lost. It is easy to imagine Doggerland as a European Atlantis, but the comparison is both illuminating and misleading. Unlike Atlantis, Doggerland is not a tale of hubris punished by the gods. It is the record of climate and time reshaping the earth. And yet, like Atlantis, it stands as a symbol of how fragile civilizations truly are. What vanished under the North Sea was not a mythical empire, but real communities, real families, real traditions that endured for millennia before they were extinguished. To remember Doggerland is not to indulge fantasy, but to acknowledge the vulnerability that underlies human history. Even today, traces of Doggerland emerge in unsettling ways. A fisherman pulling up a bone from the depths feels the tug not only of his net, but of time itself. A seismic map revealing ancient riverbeds beneath the waves forces us to reimagine coastlines not as eternal, but as temporary. Offshore engineers, scanning the seabed for pipelines, stumble upon the ghost of a lost continent. Each discovery unsettles the certainty of maps and borders, reminding us that the landscapes we know are only fleeting arrangements of land and water. What remains, then, is a haunting invitation to look into Doggerland not only as a lost place, but as a mirror. It compels us to ask what parts of our present may one day vanish as utterly as it did. How will future generations remember our cities if they are drowned by rising seas? What myths will be told of our own vanished coastlines? Will we too become a whisper in sediment, a faint trace discovered by those who come after us? In the end, Doggerland is not just about what was lost, but about what the loss means. It reminds us that history is not linear, not secure, not guaranteed. It is fragile, like a shoreline at high tide, always vulnerable to erasure. The bones and tools lifted from the seabed are not only artifacts of prehistory, they are fragments of a lesson that everything we call permanent is only provisional, that every land can be swallowed, that silence always waits. And so the drowned plane continues to haunt the imagination, both as fact and as symbol. It exists in the scientific data of geologists and the whispered myths of storytellers, in the tusks of mammoths and the nets of fishermen, in the maps that reveal rivers flowing under waves. Yet the full truth of Doggerland will never return. It lies beyond recovery, held fast by the sea, compelling us to face the emptiness it left behind. And in that emptiness, we are forced to ask, when land itself can vanish, what else in history has already slipped away unnoticed? When the sea rose and Doggerland disappeared, it was not only a physical landscape that vanished, but a framework of connection. The loss altered not just coastlines, but identities, creating the illusion of separations that had never existed before. Before the waters came, Britain was no island, but a peninsula joined seamlessly to the continent. The Thames flowed into rivers that met the Rhine, carving channels across a fertile plain. Hunters, families, and travelers moved without barriers across a continuous world. The drowning of Doggerland fractured this continuity, leaving behind islands, shores, and boundaries that would later shape the idea of nations. But in its earliest form, Europe was unified not by empire or trade routes, but by a land that joined what now appears divided. The first humans to set foot on this land may have come tens of thousands of years earlier, following herds and seeking shelter in forests as the ice sheets retreated. By the Mesolithic, it was more than a corridor. It was home. Evidence points to settlements scattered along rivers, where people fished, gathered reeds, and tracked the movements of game. Their tools were not primitive improvisations, but carefully shaped flints, microliths that could be fitted into wooden shafts to form arrows or spears. These objects, lifted from trawler nets or dredged from sediments, remind us that Doggerland's people lived within systems of knowledge, passing down craft techniques, adapting them to the changing world. They were innovators, not just survivors. Yet the drowning of Doggerland has left us with more than archaeological puzzles. It forces us to confront the instability of memory itself. Why, when this land was so vast and so integral, was it not preserved in any direct historical record? Oral traditions may have carried fragments of its story, but when written cultures emerged, Doggerland was already long submerged. Its absence meant later peoples could invent boundaries that seemed natural, an island Britain, a continental Europe. But this was an illusion born from forgetting. History was written on the assumption that the sea had always divided these places, when in truth the sea had only recently stolen them away. This erasure is not innocent. To imagine Britain as eternally separate from the continent is to reinforce a narrative of isolation, of difference, of destiny apart. Yet the truth is far less stable. For thousands of years, Britain and Europe were joined, their peoples connected. Doggerland's drowning severed that link, but the memory of connection was allowed to fade until the sea itself seemed like an eternal border. Was this forgetting convenient? Did the construction of national myths depend, even unconsciously, on the erasure of the land that once unified? When we think of history as the product of empires, churches, and kingdoms, we overlook the way geography itself is manipulated into story. Doggerland reminds us that even landscapes can be edited, rewritten, or silenced. The scientific rediscovery of Doggerland has only deepened this paradox. Oil companies mapping the seabed for resources in the 20th century inadvertently revealed the drowned valleys and ancient riverbeds that crisscrossed the plain. Archaeologists saw in these seismic surveys the ghost of a continent. Yet these revelations emerged not from the pursuit of history, but from industry, from profit-seeking endeavors. Even now, most of what we know about Doggerland comes not from excavation, but from accidents. Fossils caught in nets, artifacts disturbed by dredging, data repurposed from corporate surveys. It is as though the land itself resists being remembered directly, offering only fragments, only glimpses, as if to remind us that some histories can never be fully reclaimed. Consider the Storegga Slide, that ancient catastrophe off the coast of Norway. When the seabed collapsed and sent a tsunami racing toward Doggerland, it must have been experienced as an apocalypse. A wave 30 meters high crashing into low plains would not simply destroy, it would transform everything. Families would be forced to flee, carrying only what they could, abandoning hearths and graves to the water. Survivors would arrive in new lands as outsiders, strangers carrying memories of a drowned homeland. Perhaps this is the seed of so many European flood myths, the deep trauma of being displaced by water, told and retold until it was no longer history, but legend. Yet what is legend if not memory translated into symbol? The waves that erased Doggerland may also have carved themselves into the collective unconscious of Europe. The silence surrounding Doggerland in our modern imagination reveals another discomfort. The recognition that we, too, live on shifting ground. The seas are rising again, slowly but inexorably, and the thought of drowned cities is no longer confined to myths. Venice sinks, coastlines erode, islands vanish. To remember Doggerland is to see our reflection in deep time, a warning that nothing we build is immune to the tides. This makes the story of Doggerland not only an archaeological curiosity, but a parable for the present, a reminder that our civilizations, too, may one day be reduced to fragments beneath the sea. And yet there is an undeniable allure to the mystery. To think of Doggerland is to think of lives erased so completely that only hints remain. There is beauty in that absence, in the way it forces the imagination to fill the gaps. The drowned valleys suggest not only loss, but possibility, that history is never finished, that beneath the surface there are always stories waiting to be unearthed. But Doggerland resists total recovery. It will never give up its full truth. Perhaps that is what makes it powerful. It reminds us of the limits of knowledge, of the humility required when facing the vastness of time. As waves crash against the shores of Britain and the Netherlands today, they mask the continuity that once existed beneath them. The waters hide valleys where rivers once flowed, forests where firelight once flickered, plains where hunters once tracked herds across the horizon. But the sea cannot erase entirely. In pollen grains, in bones, in stone tools, fragments remain. These fragments speak not in clear sentences, but in whispers, in questions, in possibilities. And those whispers unsettle the stories we tell about who we are and where we come from. So we return to the question: why was Doggerland forgotten? Was it simply swallowed too early, before writing, before monuments, before memory could take lasting form? Or did later centuries prefer to imagine a Europe fractured, divided, rather than connected? The silence around Doggerland is not only geological, but cultural, a silence that reveals as much about us as it does about the sea. For in forgetting, we choose what to remember, and in choosing what to remember, we shape who we believe ourselves to be. Doggerland lingers beneath the waves as both absence and presence, a reminder that what is lost is never wholly gone, only transformed. It waits as a ghost continent, invisible but not forgotten, shaping our understanding of prehistory in ways we have only begun to grasp. And in its silence, it leaves us with the haunting question: when seas rise again, whose homelands, whose cities, whose stories will vanish into the deep, remembered only as whispers in the sediment of time? To speak of Doggerland is to speak of time stretched across vast horizons, a span so immense that human memory cannot hold it whole. The landscapes beneath the North Sea were not erased in a single moment, but through a drawn-out drama of change, each century peeling away another layer until what was once a continent became a grave. The slow rise of the waters was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its gradual encroachment, extraordinary in the way it transformed everything. People living upon that land would have watched marshes form where once there were meadows, seen rivers widen into estuaries, and felt the shoreline creep closer with each generation. The sea did not suddenly invade. It advanced with patient inevitability. And yet, when the collapse came in the form of massive floods and the Storega Slide tsunami, all patience was replaced by terror. The slowness gave way to violence, and with it, the erasure of an entire world. What remains most haunting is how little survives in direct form. No monuments of stone were left to resist the sea, no inscriptions carved into walls to preserve their words. All that is left are the fragments drawn reluctantly from the seabed. In these pieces we glimpse only outlines, a harpoon tip suggesting hunting, a polished flint knife revealed with skill, a fragment of skull whispering of mortality. Yet in these objects we can sense more than utility. They are the shadows of culture, the trace of a world view lost to time. Every tool is a story, every bone a reminder that Doggerland was not just land, but life, filled with meaning we can never fully recover. The geological record itself preserves something of the drama. Core samples pulled from the seabed reveal layers of sand, peat, and clay, traces of forests drowned, marshes swallowed, riverbeds shifted. Within these strata lie pollen grains, fossilized seeds, and microscopic remains that tell of a living environment now buried beneath salt water. Birch and pine, hazel and grasses, all part of an ecosystem where humans once hunted, gathered, and perhaps even dreamed. Scientists reconstruct this world in diagrams and digital models, but no reconstruction can capture the lived experience of those who saw their horizon erased by water. That gap between data and memory is where mystery thrives. The human cost of this drowning can never be fully known. To imagine the loss is to imagine families abandoning hearths, mothers carrying children as waters surged, elders left behind as survival demanded speed. Communities that had existed for centuries must have fractured, scattered in all directions. Some fled west into Britain, others east into the mainland. Those who survived became strangers in new lands, forced to integrate or adapt among groups who may not have shared their language, their traditions, their ways of life. What stories did they carry? Did they whisper of the land they lost, teaching their children about plains where rivers once flowed? Or did those memories fade with the generations, becoming myth, then silence? Perhaps the persistence of flood myths across cultures is the faint echo of such trauma. When later people spoke of worlds drowned, of kingdoms erased by seas, they may have been recalling, not literally but symbolically, the ancestral memory of Doggerland and other lost coasts. The tale of Noah, the saga of Utnapishtim in Mesopotamia, the Welsh story of Cantre'r Gwaelod, the Breton memory of Ceris, all reflect the same deep anxiety, that what seems eternal can vanish in water. These stories may not record Doggerland directly, but they resonate with its fate. Myth and geology, story and sediment, overlap like layers in the seabed, each telling us that water does not only cleanse, it erases. The rediscovery of Doggerland in modern times carries its own uncanny resonance. In the 20th century, when oil companies surveyed the seabed for resources, they did not expect to uncover an ancient continent. Yet the seismic data revealed rivers, valleys, and ridges hidden beneath the waves, proof that a vast land had once stretched where the North Sea now churns. For archaeologists, this was revelation. The myth of a European Atlantis was not myth at all, but fact. What had been whispered in folklore and hinted at in scattered finds became undeniable. But with knowledge comes unease. To know Doggerland existed is also to confront the fragility of landscapes, to admit that our maps are never permanent, only snapshots in a restless world. What Doggerland reveals is not only a vanished land, but a pattern. Coastlines are temporary, rivers shift, seas rise, and human memory falters. The land beneath the North Sea is only one chapter in a longer story of disappearance. Other lands have followed. Lioness in Cornish legend, the fertile plains once stretching beyond the Black Sea, islands eroded into nothing by Atlantic storms. Each disappearance births both silence and story, absence and myth. Doggerland belongs to this lineage of vanishing worlds, a reminder that the earth itself is unstable, that our foundations are never as solid as they seem. To stand on the shores of the North Sea today and gaze outward is to look across a graveyard without markers. The waves conceal not only sediment, but the remnants of hearth fires, the footprints of children, the bones of animals, the ashes of rituals. Beneath that restless water lies a memory we cannot fully access, a chapter closed not by choice, but by inevitability. And yet the presence of Doggerland presses against the imagination. It compels us to ask, how much of history is hidden not by malice, but by the simple violence of nature, and how much, once hidden, becomes convenient to forget? For there is an unsettling possibility that the silence around Doggerland was not only natural, but cultural. Later histories preferred to emphasize the separateness of Britain, the destiny of nations divided by water. To recall Doggerland would be to recall a time of unity, of connection, of peoples linked by shared land. Was this memory inconvenient for empires that thrived on division, on the illusion of eternal borders? Perhaps the true drowning of Doggerland was not the flood itself, but the choice to forget it. In forgetting, the narrative of isolation became easier to sustain. But the sea never forgets. It holds Doggerland in its depths, offering fragments like offerings cast back by time itself. Each bone lifted from the nets of fishermen, each flint dredged from the seabed, is a reminder that silence is never absolute. The past insists on surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. Doggerland speaks not in words but in fragments, not in chronicles but in whispers, and in those whispers lies the invitation to reimagine what we think we know of Europe's past. Doggerland haunts us because it reminds us of our own fragility. We too live on coastlines that shift, on lands that may one day be claimed by rising seas. The story of Doggerland is not just a prehistoric tragedy, but a mirror. It reflects the truth that no civilization, however advanced, is immune to the power of water. One day, perhaps, our cities will lie where fish swim, our monuments will crumble beneath waves, and our stories will become whispers in sediments. And if that day comes, will future archaeologists wonder at the fragments we leave behind, piecing together our lives from shards and bones, asking what it meant to live before the flood? In the silence beneath the North Sea, Doggerland waits, not as a myth, but as a lesson carved into the earth itself, that permanence is an illusion, and that history is always one tide away from being erased. There is a certain unease that comes with imagining Doggerland, not only because of its physical disappearance, but because of how it challenges the story we tell ourselves about continuity. We imagine human history as a line, rising, progressing, enduring through disruption. But the story of Doggerland is one of rupture. Here was a land as large as modern Britain, inhabited for thousands of years, yet it was erased so completely that even its memory dissolved into silence. What we know comes not from chronicles or ruins, but from chance recoveries. A bone lodged in a net, a fragment of antler shaped by a hand now long forgotten, a trace of pollen hidden in sediment. Each fragment whispers, but never speaks fully. In the quiet of those fragments, the question lingers. How many other worlds, how many other chapters have been lost in the same way? To think of Doggerland is to think of its people. Archaeologists classify them as Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, but such labels risk flattening the complexity of their existence. They were not faceless figures wandering aimlessly across plains, but families who shaped their surroundings, who carried traditions, who honored life and death in ways that remain invisible to us. The flint blades they left behind suggest a mastery of technique, a refinement passed through generations. The harpoons carved from bone and antler speak of knowledge of rivers, of patience, of rituals of the hunt. These people lived not as fragments, but as whole societies, yet all that survives of them are pieces scattered across the seabed like echoes half heard. It is tempting to imagine them only in terms of survival, tracking herds, fishing the rivers, gathering plants. Yet survival is never the whole of human life. There must have been stories, songs, gestures of reverence before the fire, symbols carved into wood or bone that the sea did not preserve. When the waters rose and the floods came, it was not merely tools and hearths that were lost, but entire cosmologies. If one tries to picture what it meant to watch the land vanish, one must also picture the psychological world collapsing with it. A horizon once fixed became unstable, the graves of ancestors swallowed by waves, the rhythms of hunting and gathering torn apart. What language does a people create when the very earth beneath them is taken? The Storegga Slide tsunami looms as a pivotal event in this story. Scientists estimate that a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway some 800 years ago sent waves surging across the North Sea basin. At Doggerland's low-lying marshes and valleys, the impact would have been catastrophic. A wall of water would have rushed inland, erasing villages, tearing forests apart, scattering survivors. If such an event struck today, it would be called apocalyptic. For those living then, it must have felt like the gods themselves had risen from the sea in fury. The memory of such a cataclysm would not vanish easily. It might be retold in fragments, remembered as warning, mythologized into tales of a world swallowed by water. And perhaps those very tales, scattered across Europe in different forms, are what we now call flood myths. But Doggerland is not remembered by name. No legend in Britain, no saga in Denmark, no chronicle from the Low Countries speaks of a drowned plane joining their shores. The silence is almost more striking than the fragments. Why does such an immense loss leave so little trace in cultural memory? Was it simply too ancient? Too far removed from later peoples who began writing their histories? Or did the forgetting itself serve a purpose? When nations later constructed their identities, Britain as island, Europe as continent, perhaps it was easier to imagine separation as destiny rather than accident. Doggerland disrupts that destiny, reminding us that what we call borders are recent and fragile. To remember, it would be to remember that Europe was once continuous, not divided. In this sense, the rediscovery of Doggerland is both revelation and disturbance. In the late 20th century, when seismic surveys revealed its drowned valleys and rivers, the story of Europe shifted. Suddenly, the sea was not eternal. It was temporary. The notion of permanent geography was exposed as illusion. For thousands of years, humans lived on land now hidden. This revelation unsettles the present because it forces us to admit that what feels permanent today may one day lie beneath water. Our maps are not timeless. They are moments frozen in a shifting world. Doggerland is the reminder of that instability, a reminder carried not in myth, but in science. The artifacts lifted from the seabed carry with them a quiet dignity. A polished flint blade, shaped with care, suggests more than function. It suggests memory, tradition, and the desire to create permanence in a world that was anything but permanent. A human bone dredged from the sea is not merely a specimen, it is a life interrupted, a story never told, a presence that demands recognition. These objects do not belong only to the past. They belong to us, too, as fragments of a shared history we did not know we had lost. To hold such an object is to feel time collapse, to sense a kinship across millennia, and to be reminded that the boundary between past and present is thinner than it seems. And still the silence persists. Doggerland is not a place we can visit, not a landscape we can walk. It is a ghost continent, sensed only through sonar images and fragments pulled unwillingly from the sea. Its valleys remain dark, its forests rotted to peat, its hearths long extinguished. Yet the very inaccessibility of Doggerland gives it power. It becomes a symbol of all that is irretrievably lost, all that lies beyond recovery. We can reconstruct its rivers on a map, but we cannot reconstruct the minds that once gazed across them. We can recover bones, but not the stories those bones once heard. The sea guards those secrets, and perhaps always will. And so Doggerland lingers as a lesson. It teaches that loss is as central to history as survival. It teaches that silence is not absence, but another form of memory, a memory written in erasure. And it teaches that we too live upon fragile ground. The seas are rising again, creeping inch by inch towards cities, coastlines, and islands. One day, perhaps, our descendants will look back at us as we look at Doggerland, piecing together fragments of a drowned world, wondering what stories we told, what songs we sang, what meaning we made before the water came. In that haunting parallel, Doggerland becomes more than prehistory. It becomes prophecy. It tells us that no land is forever, no civilization immune, no story guaranteed to survive. Beneath the waves of the North Sea lies not just a vanished past, but a warning written in silence. And as we listen to that silence, we are left with the question that has no answer. When our own time of drowning comes, what will remain of us? The mystery of Doggerland doesn't lie only in what was lost, but in how loss reshaped the very structure of human memory. A continent drowned, and with it a continuity broken. What survived was not the land itself, but the scattering of its people. To imagine those survivors is to imagine the beginnings of dislocation, the creation of new boundaries where once there were none. They did not vanish with their homeland. They fled, carrying fragments of their culture, their tools, and perhaps their stories, depositing them across the newly formed coastlines of Britain, Scandinavia, and continental Europe. Each fragment left behind in these new lands would become part of another narrative, absorbed into communities that may never have fully understood the weight of the stories arriving with strangers from the sea. It is here that Doggerland becomes not merely a lost world, but a root system feeding into Europe's later growth. If refugees from the floods brought with them new techniques, traditions, and myths, then Doggerland survives not only beneath the waves, but within the cultural DNA of the continent. Archaeologists note that the Mesolithic communities of northern Europe shared similarities in tool-making, in fishing techniques, in patterns of settlement that suggest more than coincidence. Could these parallels be the echoes of Doggerland's diaspora, scattered by water but united by memory? If so, the drowned land did not disappear. It diffused, shaping what would come after. And yet, how faint those echoes are. We search for Doggerland not in monuments or writings, but in subtle clues. The angle of a flint blade, the type of antler harpoon, the pollen preserved in peat. These fragments require imagination as much as science, for they do not tell their story plainly. They demand that we lean into silence, that we accept what cannot be known, and in that acceptance discover meaning. Doggerland teaches us to read absence as presence, to see in the gaps of history the outlines of lives once lived. The silence of Doggerland is not emptiness, but resonance, a hum beneath the surface of time. The rediscovery of this drowned world is recent, and its timing is not without significance. For centuries, fishermen pulled bones and tools from the seabed without understanding their meaning. Only when technology developed, the seismic surveys of oil exploration, the sonar maps of marine science, did the drowned valleys and rivers come into view. The revelation arrived in the 20th century, precisely when human beings themselves were beginning to alter coastlines through industry, dams, and rising seas. Doggerland emerged into consciousness at the very moment humanity began to see its own landscapes as fragile. Its return is not merely academic, but prophetic, a reminder that what happened before can happen again. Consider the Storegga slide once more, that great undersea landslide that hurled a tsunami across the North Atlantic. Its waves drowned Doggerland's lowlands, erasing villages and forests. In geological terms, such events are rare, yet they happen. We are accustomed to thinking of catastrophe as myth. Atlantis swallowed, kingdoms drowned, but in Doggerland we see myth grounded in sediment. The slide is not a tale, but a measurable fact, and yet the survivor's memory may well have transformed it into tale, into warning, into something carried forward in story until the story itself became myth. This is the strange alchemy of memory. Geology becomes story, story becomes legend, legend becomes silence, until only the sea remains. The unsettling truth is that Doggerland complicates not only Europe's geography but its history. For to acknowledge Doggerland is to admit that the neat separation of islands and continents, of nations and peoples, is an illusion born of erasure. Britain was not an island until Doggerland drowned. The identities built upon its insularity, the stories of separation, of difference, of destiny apart from the continent, rest on forgetting. To recall Doggerland is to destabilize these stories, to remember a time when Britain and Europe were one body, not divided. Is it any wonder, then, that Doggerland remained hidden so long, more absent from school books than from the seabed? To tell its story is to unsettle the foundations of later narratives. Archaeologists reconstruct its landscapes with care. Digital models reveal rivers winding toward estuaries, wetlands rich with fish, forests alive with game. These reconstructions are beautiful, but they are also elegiac. They are not the land itself, but a ghost image, a map of what cannot be walked again. To gaze at them is to feel both wonder and grief. Wonder at the richness of what once was, grief at its vanishing. And in that grief lies the question: how much of ourselves is shaped not by what we inherit, but by what has been taken? Doggerland may have disappeared, but in its disappearance it shaped the course of European history as profoundly as any empire. It is no coincidence that Doggerland has been compared to Atlantis, but the comparison, though imperfect, reveals something deeper. Atlantis is remembered through myth, Doggerland through geology. One is legend, the other sediment. Yet both are about the same truth: that civilizations, however enduring they seem, are vulnerable to the sea. The myth of Atlantis has endured precisely because it speaks to a fear that is universal, the fear that land is not secure, that permanence is fragile. Doggerland transforms that fear into fact. The waves do not care for culture. They erase indiscriminately, leaving behind only traces for others to puzzle over millennia later. To stand on the shore of the North Sea and think of Doggerland is to feel the weight of that erasure pressing against the present. The horizon hides valleys, rivers, forests that once thrived. Every wave that breaks upon the shore carries with it the silence of that lost world. The sea becomes not only a body of water but a shroud, concealing a story we can only half reconstruct. And perhaps that is why Doggerland haunts us more than other lost lands. It is not myth. It is fact. Its absence is real, its silence measurable. And in that silence, we hear the echo of our own fragility. For what Doggerland ultimately teaches is humility. The people who lived there surely believed their land would endure, that the rivers would always flow, that the forests would always stand. They could not imagine the horizon itself advancing to swallow everything they knew. And yet it did. We, too, imagine permanence in our cities, our nations, our monuments. We think of coastlines as fixed, but the drowned plain beneath the North Sea whispers otherwise. It tells us that permanence is illusion, that we live not upon solid ground, but upon shifting thresholds. And so Doggerland waits, its story both buried and present. It compels us not to seek final answers, but to sit with questions. What was lost when the waves came? What stories dissolved with the marshes? What memories still linger in myths of flood and ruin? And perhaps most haunting of all, what will future generations say of us when they sift through fragments of our drowned world? The sea holds the silence, but silence is never empty. It is filled with questions, with echoes, with the ghost of what once was. Doggerland is that silence, reminding us that history is not only what we preserve, but also what we lose. The silence of Doggerland deepens when one considers the vast networks it once sustained. It was not a barren bridge of land, but a living artery that connected peoples, a meeting place of rivers and plains where movement was fluid and boundaries undefined. Through Doggerland flowed the Thames and the Rhine, streams that joined into marshes and estuaries alive with fish and birds. This was a land of abundance, a fertile plain where herds of red deer and aurochs moved across open ground, where wild horses grazed, where hunters followed seasonal cycles with knowledge passed down through generations. The drowned land was not marginal, but central, a heart that beat between Britain and Europe before the sea extinguished its pulse. If one listens closely to the fragments recovered from the seabed, an image begins to emerge, not of an isolated world, but of one deeply enmeshed in the wider patterns of prehistory. The flints shaped into microliths are not crude improvisations, but works of skill, indicating communities who shared techniques across wide regions. Similarities appear between finds in Doggerland and those on the continent, suggesting exchange, interaction, perhaps even kinship across rivers and forests that are now gone. Doggerland was not only home, but corridor, a connective tissue that bound together early Europeans in ways we can only faintly discern. Its drowning severed not only land, but the threads of interaction, scattering communities that had once lived as neighbors. The psychological weight of that rupture must have been immense. Imagine a community who had known the same valleys and rivers for centuries, forced to abandon them as waters rose. The land itself became unstable, familiar paths vanishing, hunting grounds swallowed. What does it mean for identity when the earth beneath one's feet is no longer secure? Displacement is not only physical, it is cultural. When the Doggerland peoples fled to higher ground, they carried not only their tools, but their cosmologies, reshaping them to fit new landscapes. What had been stable for generations became impermanent, and impermanence may have become woven into their myths. Perhaps that is why flood stories echo across so many traditions, because they are not merely symbolic, but ancestral memories of trauma lived and retold. The Storegga tsunami is often cited as the final blow, a sudden violence that drowned much of what remained of Doggerland around 8,200 years ago. But long before that wave, the sea was already creeping inland. Coastal settlements must have moved repeatedly, each generation watching the shoreline advance. This slow violence may have been more disorienting than the sudden catastrophe. To live with the knowledge that the land was shrinking, that the marshes were spreading, that each season brought more water. This was to live with dread disguised as inevitability. Perhaps rituals emerged to appease the waters. Perhaps stories were told of ancestors swallowed by the sea. And when the great wave finally came, it may have felt less like surprise and more like fulfillment of a fate long expected. Modern science, with its seismic surveys and sediment cores, tells us of rivers drowned and forests buried in peat, but it cannot tell us how it felt. For that, we turn to imagination, informed by fragments. The antler harpoon dredged from the seabed suggests more than a tool. It suggests the intimacy of hands shaping bone, of a hunter preparing for the moment when survival depends on skill and patience. The bones of mammoth and aurochs remind us of abundance, but also of change, for by the time the waters rose, those great beasts were already fading from Doggerland's plains. Extinction and drowning overlapped, one loss folded into another, leaving the people of that land in a world of diminishing horizons. Doggerland also unsettles our sense of what Europe means. The neat categories of island and continent dissolve in its memory. Britain, before the flood, was no island but an extension of the mainland, joined by fertile ground that stretched across what is now open sea. The separation of Britain and Europe, so central to later history, is therefore an illusion of recent time. To remember Doggerland is to remember that division is temporary, that what we think of as natural borders are fragile, contingent, shaped by forces beyond human control. The sea that now divides was once land that united. To admit this is to admit that the foundations of identity are not eternal, but constructed upon forgetting. In many ways, the rediscovery of Doggerland feels like an intrusion into a narrative carefully constructed over centuries. Histories written by kingdoms and nations depended on separation, on the sense of boundaries given permanence by water. Doggerland disrupts that story, reminding us of a time when those boundaries did not exist. No wonder, then, that it remained absent from cultural memory. Its existence was not useful for the myths of empire or nation. It was more convenient to let the sea's silence remain unbroken, to accept the illusion of natural division. Only when science forced the drowned valleys into view did Doggerland re-emerge, not as myth, but as fact, and with it the unease of truths long forgotten. But perhaps Doggerland has never truly been absent. Perhaps it has lingered as ghost memory in the flood myths of Europe, the Welsh tales of Cantre Gwaelod, the Breton story of Ceres, the Cornish memory of Lyonesse. Each speaks of a land swallowed by the sea, of a people forced to flee, of a loss too immense to comprehend. Scholars argue whether these tales arose independently or as dim echoes of real geological events. But the pattern is too striking to ignore. Doggerland may not be named in any of them, but its fate may be inscribed symbolically, transformed into story that survived even as the land itself disappeared. Doggerland's silence, then, is not total. It speaks in fragments, in myths, in the unease we feel when we look at maps and realize the sea has not always been where it is now. It speaks in the bones of animals that no longer walk the earth, in the tools shaped by hands that are dust. It speaks in the absence itself, the knowledge that a continent could vanish so thoroughly that it was forgotten for millennia. That silence is not emptiness. It is warning. For what Doggerland teaches is not only that the past is fragile, but that the present is too. The sea is rising again. Coastlines shift once more. Cities that believe themselves eternal may one day lie where Doggerland lies now, beneath waves, remembered only in fragments. Venice, New Orleans, Jakarta, all may join the drowned world in time. Doggerland is not only prehistory but prophecy, a mirror held to our own moment. To remember it is to face the possibility of our own erasure, to accept that what seems permanent is always provisional. And so Doggerland lingers, half forgotten, half revealed, a ghost beneath the North Sea that unsettles both past and future. It asks us to listen not only to what has been preserved, but to what has been lost, to the silence that surrounds all civilizations. For in that silence lies the most haunting truth of all, that nothing endures untouched, that every land can drown, and that one day our own stories may lie buried in the silt, waiting to be rediscovered by others who will wonder, as we wonder now, what it meant to live before the flood. The enigma of Doggerland becomes even more haunting when one considers how thoroughly it disappeared, not only from the surface of the earth, but from the consciousness of those who came after. Most lost civilizations leave behind ruins, stones stacked into walls, fragments of temples, inscriptions cut into clay or stone. Doggerland left only silence, as if the sea conspired to erase not just the land itself, but the very memory of its existence. That silence is what makes the fragments we recover so striking. A piece of bone, a flint blade, a pollen grain embedded in peat. These are not merely objects, but breaches in the veil, small ruptures in the forgetting. They remind us that this land was once alive with voices, with breath, with footsteps on soil now hidden beneath gray waters. The silence is partly geological, the result of millennia of burial beneath waves, but it is also cultural. Later peoples built their histories without Doggerland. Britain became an island in imagination as much as geography, and Europe became a continent bound by seas rather than plains. The memory of a unified landscape vanished, replaced by stories of separation, difference, and borders. In this way, the drowning of Doggerland was not only a natural disaster, but a narrative one. It allowed later identities to form unchallenged by the inconvenient truth that what was divided had once been joined. The forgetting itself became part of the architecture of Europe's self-understanding. What then of those who lived through the drowning? The people of Doggerland were not nameless shadows, but communities that thrived for thousands of years. They lived by rivers that no longer flow, hunted across marshes now lost to the tide, and raised children in valleys where fish now swim. They carried knowledge of seasons, of migrations, of the movements of game and the cycles of plants. This knowledge was hard-won, accumulated across generations. And then, suddenly, the very landscape that sustained it was torn away. To survive, they would have had to carry that knowledge into new lands, reshaping it for unfamiliar environments. Displacement, therefore, was not only physical but intellectual, a scattering of wisdom as well as of people. The echoes of this displacement can be faintly traced. Archaeologists note similarities in Mesolithic sites across northern Europe, in the tools used, in the ways communities organized themselves along rivers and coasts. These may be coincidences of adaptation, but they may also be the fingerprints of Doggerland's diaspora, the invisible traces of a people forced to scatter. If so, then Doggerland's legacy lives not only beneath the sea, but in the cultural patterns of the lands its people entered. It is a legacy diffused rather than preserved, dissolved into Europe's broader story. Like salt in water, it is everywhere and nowhere, inseparable from what followed. And yet, when one gazes at the sea today, it is hard not to feel the weight of absence. Beneath the waves lies a land the size of a country, erased so completely that only science has restored it to imagination. Sonar images reveal ancient riverbeds, but these are maps without voices. They show us the shapes of valleys and plains, but not the rituals performed upon them, the songs sung beside their waters, the stories told under their stars. The gap between what we can recover and what we cannot is vast, and in that gap lies the haunting power of Doggerland. It is not only lost land, but lost meaning, not only drowned forests, but drowned memories. This absence places Doggerland alongside other flood stories, real and mythical. The Black Sea Deluge, proposed by some geologists as a source for Near Eastern flood myths, echoes with similar themes of sudden inundation. In Mesopotamia, the tale of Utnapishtim recounts a flood that swept away all but a remnant. In biblical tradition, Noah becomes the vessel of survival. In Welsh legend, Cantre'r Gwaelod sinks beneath the sea, a reminder of hubris punished by water. These stories may not record Doggerland directly, but they resonate with its fate. They suggest that flood is a universal motif, one that speaks both to geological reality and to the human fear of impermanence. Doggerland may have been forgotten in name, but its trauma may live on in symbol. To see Doggerland in this way is to see it not as an anomaly, but as part of a broader truth. That civilizations, however enduring they seem, are fragile before the sea. The waves are relentless, eroding not only coasts but certainty. Doggerland reminds us that the ground beneath us is never as stable as we wish to believe. Cities built on coastlines, however grand, are provisional. Nations defined by geography are temporary. The permanence we cling to is only illusion. Beneath the North Sea lies the evidence of this truth, a country erased and forgotten, proof that even vast landscapes can vanish utterly. The rediscovery of Doggerland through modern science makes this lesson even sharper. When seismic scans revealed drowned rivers and valleys, the revelation was not just academic, it was existential. It forced us to see our own maps as fragile, our own coasts as vulnerable. The past became mirror to the present. Just as Doggerland was lost to rising seas, so too may our cities one day be claimed by the waters. The silence beneath the North Sea is not just history, it is warning. To look at Doggerland is to look at the possibility of our own drowning, our own erasure. Yet there is also something deeply poetic in Doggerland's silence. Its absence invites imagination, compels us to fill the gaps with story. Archaeologists reconstruct its rivers, writers imagine its people, myths absorb its trauma. The land itself is gone, but its ghost persists, both in the fragments we recover and in the questions we cannot answer. That ghost is what makes Doggerland so powerful. It is both fact and symbol, both geology and metaphor. It exists in the ground beneath the sea and in the human mind that longs to understand what was lost. And so Doggerland lingers, not as a place we can visit, not as a story we can complete, but as a silence that presses against our imagination. It asks us to accept that much of history is invisible, that loss is as real as preservation, that forgetting is as powerful as remembering. It asks us to live with absence, to honor the fragments without expecting completeness. And in doing so, it forces us to confront the fragility of our own world. The drowned land beneath the North Sea remains, patient and voiceless, a reminder that permanence is illusion, and that history is always shifting beneath our feet. To remember Doggerland is to remember that silence itself can be history, that what has been erased still shapes what survives. And in that silence, the question that lingers is not only what was lost, but what we are willing to forget. The silence of Doggerland becomes most profound when one considers that it existed for millennia, yet is absent from almost every cultural record. For thousands of years, its valleys, rivers, and forests sustained human life. Families built generations of memory upon its soil, and still, when the waves rose, the land seemed to vanish not only from sight, but from remembrance. This vanishing is more than geological. It is psychological, cultural, almost spiritual. To stand on the edge of the North Sea today is to stare into a void of memory as much as a void of geography. Beneath the restless waters lies a civilization so completely erased that only fragments washed ashore in fishermen's nets whisper of its existence. When scientists first reconstructed Doggerland, it was through fragments that seemed almost accidental. Oil companies charted the seabed for pipelines and discovered valleys and ridges invisible to the human eye. Archaeologists examined the seismic scans and saw not chaos, but order. The branching of rivers, the shapes of floodplains, the shadows of drowned landscapes. Suddenly, the North Sea was no longer an empty expanse of water, but a palimpsest of ancient geography. The shock of that realization cannot be overstated. What had been dismissed as a myth, a European Atlantis, became tangible, measurable, undeniable. Yet with this revelation came unease, for to accept Doggerland is to accept that even continents are impermanent, that entire countries can vanish and leave behind almost no trace. It is striking that Doggerland was once larger than many nations of Europe, yet no name for it survives in myth. Unlike Atlantis, which lives in story, Doggerland was simply erased. Perhaps its memory did not survive because it drowned too early, before written traditions. Or perhaps its memory was scattered with its people, dispersed into whispers that lost their original reference. Flood myths might hold the echoes, but the land itself is nameless in history. The absence of a name feels like a second drowning, a loss not just of geography, but of identity. To lose a place is tragedy. To lose the memory of its name is erasure at the deepest level. And yet the artifacts we recover insist that life was full, vibrant, and enduring. Flint blades sharpened with precision, harpoons carved with skill, bones of animals hunted with ritual care. These objects breathe life into the drowned silence. They speak of hunters who tracked the red deer across open plains, of families who gathered reeds along marshes, of children who learned by watching hands shape flint into tools. These were not shadowy figures, but people as real as us, bound to their land by necessity and by meaning. The sea has buried their voices, but it has not buried the evidence of their existence. Each artifact is a defiance of oblivion, a fragment demanding to be recognized. The haunting question is what knowledge was lost with them. Archaeology can reconstruct tools and diets, but it cannot reconstruct cosmology. What did these people believe when they saw the waters rise? Did they interpret the encroaching sea as punishment, as fate, as the will of spirits, or as a cycle of nature beyond human control? What rituals were performed when graves of ancestors were swallowed? What stories were told to children as warnings of the advancing tide? These are the silences we cannot break, the questions that echo endlessly when we look into the drowned valleys. The fragments tell us that they lived, but they cannot tell us how they made sense of loss. The Storega slide tsunami looms as one of the most devastating events in this story. A single surge of water that may have obliterated entire settlements. To imagine it is to imagine terror on an incomprehensible scale. The sudden roar of water, the sky darkened by waves, the land dissolving beneath an unstoppable force. Survivors must have fled to higher ground, disoriented, stripped of everything familiar. The trauma of such an event would leave scars not only on lives, but on memory. Scars that may have become stories of wrathful seas and drowned kingdoms. Perhaps these stories traveled with the refugees, carried into Europe and Britain, reshaped into myths that endured even as their origin faded. But the silence of Doggerland is not only a relic of prehistory, it is also a mirror. We too live in a world where seas are rising. Our coastlines erode, storms grow stronger, and cities built upon the illusion of permanence face uncertain futures. To study Doggerland is to glimpse our own fragility written in deep time. What happened to that lost plane is not confined to the past. It is a pattern that may repeat. One day, perhaps, archaeologists will examine our drowned cities as we examine Doggerland, piecing together lives from fragments, wondering how we interpreted the waters that rose around us. This parallel is what makes Doggerland more than an archaeological curiosity. It is a prophecy. It tells us that erasure is part of the human story, that civilizations can vanish not with conquest but with water, not with violence but with inevitability. The drowned valleys beneath the North Sea are not only about those who came before us, they are about us too and what will follow. To forget Doggerland is to forget that we too are vulnerable to the tides. To remember it is to face the uncomfortable truth that permanence is a story we tell ourselves, not a fact. Doggerland also unsettles the way we think about Europe itself. The narrative of Britain as an island, distinct and separate, collapses when confronted with the reality that for thousands of years it was joined by fertile plains to the continent. The drowning of Doggerland created the geography upon which later political identities were built. To remember Doggerland is to remember that division was not destiny, but disaster. not eternal, but accidental. And if those divisions were born of forgetting, then how fragile are the identities built upon them? The silence of Doggerland, therefore, is not neutral. It is a silence that shaped history by what it concealed. The lesson of Doggerland is that loss is as much a part of history as survival. We build monuments and write chronicles to preserve, but the earth itself erases with equal power. What endures is not always what is most important, but what happens to escape the tides. The drowned land beneath the North Sea reminds us that most of human experience has already been lost, scattered into silence. And yet, in that silence lies meaning. To listen to Doggerland is to listen not for answers but for questions, to embrace the mystery as part of the truth. And so the waves continue to conceal a land that was once alive with forests, rivers, and people. Doggerland waits, patient and voiceless, a ghost continent that challenges us to reconsider not only what we know of the past, but what we believe about the present. It leaves us with no closure, only a lingering question. If so much could vanish so completely, what else in history has already been erased beyond recall? And what of our own world, poised on the edge of rising seas? What of it will survive, and what will be consigned to silence beneath the waves? The story of Doggerland becomes even more enigmatic when one considers not only its physical erasure, but the cultural void that followed. Entire regions of Europe carry myths of drowned kingdoms, of bells tolling beneath the sea, of lands once fertile now hidden by restless tides. In Wales, Cantor Gwaelod speaks of a sunken plain ruled by princes who failed to protect their walls from the sea. In Brittany, the tale of Caer Ais tells of a magnificent city engulfed by waves. In Cornwall, the memory of Lyonesse lingers, said to have stretched between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly. None of these legends mention Doggerland directly, yet the resonance is unmistakable. It is as though the trauma of drowning, whether from Doggerland's loss or from other vanished coasts, echoed across centuries in stories transformed into morality plays and myths. The absence of Doggerland's name in legend may not mean it was forgotten entirely. It may mean its memory dissolved into symbols too profound to tether to a single place. This pattern reveals something unsettling about human history. We do not preserve memory in neat lines, but in echoes, distortions, fragments that become story. What was once geography becomes mythology. What was once lived experience becomes allegory. Doggerland may live on in Europe's flood myths, not as precise history, but as archetype. And in that transformation lies both preservation and erasure. Preservation of the trauma, erasure of the place. The land itself is gone, but its loss reverberates in stories that transcend its geography. The rediscovery of Doggerland in modern times exposes this duality. When sonar maps revealed its drowned valleys, the scientific community confirmed what myth had long intuited. Land can vanish. Seas can claim whole worlds. Yet unlike myth, science offers no moral lesson, only data. Riverbeds traced underwater, peat deposits dated by radiocarbon, pollen grains mapped to reconstruct forests. All of these tell us what existed, but not how it was understood by those who lived it. The contrast between myth and science leaves a gap, a silence that neither fully resolves. Myth remembers without precision. Science recovers without meaning. Doggerland lies between the two, a truth that refuses to be fully contained by either. This gap forces us to ask difficult questions about memory itself. How do we choose what to preserve and what to forget? Entire empires leave behind chronicles, monuments, inscriptions carved into stone. Yet Doggerland, larger than many kingdoms, vanished almost without trace. Was this purely chance? Or does it reveal something deeper about the fragility of oral tradition, the precariousness of memory carried only in the breath of words? When the land drowned, perhaps its stories drowned too, leaving only the faintest residue in myths scattered across Europe. And perhaps this is the true tragedy of Doggerland. Not only that it was lost, but that it could not be remembered in its own name. The fragments that surface today are poignant reminders of this tragedy. A flint microlith, sharp enough to pierce hide, tells us of a hunter's craft. An antler harpoon, smooth from the shaping of hands, whispers of rivers now buried in silt. The skull of an aurochs, lifted from the seabed, speaks of herds once grazing across open plains. These are not just remnants of survival, they are the residue of meaning. To hold them is to feel the weight of absence pressing against the present. Yet they remain mute, stripped of the stories that once animated them. Without the voices of Doggerland's people, these objects are fragments of a language we no longer speak. Still, silence itself carries meaning. The absence of Doggerland reminds us that history is built as much on forgetting as on remembering. Nations and empires curate memory, selecting what to preserve, discarding what does not serve the narrative. The drowning of Doggerland created an absence convenient for later constructions. Britain as island, Europe as continent, boundaries as eternal. To recall Doggerland would be to recall a time when such boundaries did not exist, when the sea was not a divider but a unifier. Perhaps this is why its memory faded, because it contradicted the stories that came after, because silence was easier than remembering unity in a world that sought separation. Doggerland also compels us to confront the universality of loss. It was not unique in its drowning. Coastlines everywhere have shifted, lands have been swallowed, islands have eroded into the sea. The Mediterranean holds its own drowned harbors. The Black Sea may conceal traces of earlier deluges. Across the world, flood myths mirror one another, suggesting a shared human awareness of impermanence. Doggerland is one among many, yet it embodies the theme with particular clarity. A land as vast as a country, inhabited for millennia, erased so thoroughly that only sonar and sediment recall it. Its silence magnifies the silence of all drowned worlds, standing as emblem for the countless histories already erased. What lingers most powerfully is the sense of prophecy in Doggerland's fate. For as seas rise again in our own time, we cannot look at Doggerland without seeing our reflection. Cities perched on coastlines, New York, Shanghai, Jakarta, are as vulnerable as the marsh villages of Doggerland once were. Venice already sinks. Islands in the Pacific disappear one by one. The lesson is not distant prehistory, but present urgency. Land can vanish, cultures can drown, memory can be erased. Doggerland is not only Europe's Atlantis, it is a mirror held to us, showing what may come. The silence beneath the North Sea is not only past, it is future. To confront this is to confront our own illusions of permanence. We build monuments of steel and glass, confident they will endure, but Doggerland whispers otherwise. The people of that land, too, must have thought their rivers eternal, their forests secure, their plains enduring. They could not have imagined the horizon itself advancing to swallow their world. And yet it did. What they endured is what we may endure, unless we accept the fragility that Doggerland embodies. The drowned plane reminds us that permanence is myth, that survival is always provisional. The silence of Doggerland is therefore not emptiness, but presence. It presses against us as reminder, as warning, as symbol. It is a silence that speaks, of rivers now hidden, of forests buried, of voices extinguished. And in that silence, we hear the echo of our own vulnerability. Doggerland is not only lost, it is living still in the questions it leaves unanswered, in the unease it stirs within us, in the recognition that history is fragile and memory unreliable. Perhaps this is why Doggerland haunts us more deeply than Atlantis. Atlantis is story. Doggerland is fact. Its absence is measurable, its silence undeniable. Beneath the waves of the North Sea lies proof that entire civilizations can vanish and take their memory with them. And in that silence lies the most unsettling truth of all, that our own world may someday join it, drowned and forgotten, leaving only fragments for others to find. Doggerland does not return answers. It offers only fragments and silence, questions without resolution. What was believed? What was lost? What endured in myth? These questions hang in the salt air above the North Sea, unanswerable, insistent. And perhaps this is the final gift of Doggerland, not certainty, but humility. To look into its silence is to recognize our own, to know that we too are temporary, that one day our own lands may lie where Doggerland lies now, beneath waves, beyond memory, waiting in silence. Doggerland, though drowned and silent, is not beyond reach. Its ghost rises in fragments carried upward by human hands, in maps drawn from seismic surveys, in bones caught in trawler nets. To study it is to step into an uneasy threshold between presence and absence. The land is gone, yet it remains. It is neither fully myth nor fully memory, neither entirely erased nor entirely recoverable. It exists in a liminal space, haunting our understanding of prehistory and our sense of permanence. Perhaps that is why it exerts such fascination, because it refuses to resolve into certainty. The very act of reconstructing Doggerland reveals as much about us as it does about the land itself. Scientists peer into the seabed with sonar and sediment cores, archaeologists sift through fragments of bone and flint, and historians place it against the backdrop of European myths of flood and disappearance. But each reconstruction, however precise, is a gesture of longing as much as of knowledge. We want to see what cannot be seen, to hear voices that cannot return. Every valley mapped on a computer screen, every pollen grain examined under a microscope, is part of an attempt to reanimate a silence that resists being filled. And yet, the silence remains. The fragments themselves seem to resist neat interpretation. A deer antler carved into a harpoon may speak of hunting, but it may also speak of ritual. A flint blade is a tool, but it is also an echo of knowledge shared and transmitted across generations. A mammoth bone tells of environment, but it also tells of imagination, the awe that must have filled those who saw such creatures roaming across the plains. To view these fragments as mere data is to flatten them. To imagine them fully is to acknowledge that they contain worlds we can never wholly access. Doggerland is therefore not just a land lost, but a meaning lost, and the fragments tease us with the impossibility of restoration. It is possible that Doggerland's drowning shaped more than myths. It may have altered the very trajectory of human migration and culture in Europe. As the waters advanced, populations scattered, pushing deeper into the continent, north into Scandinavia, west into what became Britain. Each movement carried with it adaptation, blending, transformation. Doggerland's disappearance forced its people into new landscapes, reshaping patterns of survival and contact. What might Europe have been if that vast plain had endured? Would Britain have remained a peninsula of the continent, changing the flow of its later history? Would the migrations and cultural fusions that defined Mesolithic Europe have taken another course? The loss of Doggerland is not just loss of land. It is the shaping of history through absence. This is why Doggerland feels like more than prehistory. It intrudes into our present, into our assumptions about what is permanent. The sea seems eternal, its boundaries unchanging. Yet Doggerland shows that the sea is restless, that it claims and releases, reshapes and erases. What we see as a fixed horizon is only temporary. The coasts we inhabit are thresholds, as vulnerable as those ancient marshes and rivers once were. To remember Doggerland is to confront the fragility of our own coastlines, the possibility that our cities may someday vanish as completely as its valleys did. And already, the parallels are too sharp to ignore. Rising seas threaten island nations and low-lying coasts across the world. Glaciers retreat, tides advance, storms intensify. We live, knowingly or not, in a Doggerland of our own making, poised at the edge of erasure. If Doggerland is history, it is also prophecy, a reminder that the drowning of a land is not only possible, but inevitable when waters rise. The silence beneath the North Sea becomes an echo of what may await our own shores. But what distinguishes Doggerland is not just that it drowned, but that it was forgotten. Atlantis survives in myth, lioness in legend, but Doggerland fell into silence for millennia. Only science restored its outline. That forgetting is perhaps more unsettling than the drowning itself. It tells us that even immense losses can vanish from memory, that whole worlds can be erased not just physically, but culturally. If Doggerland could disappear so completely, what else has been lost beyond recall? How much of human history lies submerged, erased not only by nature, but by silence? The haunting thought is that silence is itself selective. We remember what we choose to remember, what serves our stories, our identities. Doggerland was inconvenient. It contradicted the idea of Britain as naturally separate, of Europe as eternally divided by water. Its erasure allowed the myth of natural borders to flourish. Only when sonar and sediment forced it back into view did we remember that the separation of land and sea is contingent, not eternal. The silence around Doggerland was not just accidental, it was functional. Forgetting made later stories easier to tell. And yet, the fragments resist total erasure. Each bone dredged from the sea, each flint recovered from sediment, insists on presence. They remind us that forgetting is never absolute. The past pushes back, demanding to be acknowledged, even if incompletely. In this way, Doggerland becomes a kind of dialogue between silence and memory, between what is erased and what is rediscovered. It teaches us that history is never whole, but fractured, contested, always shifting like the tide. The myths of Europe, when placed alongside the geological evidence, seem almost like translations of trauma into story. Floods, drowned kingdoms, lands lost to the sea. These are not accidents of imagination, but symbolic reckonings with real geological events. Doggerland's drowning may have left no direct legend, but its trauma may have spread like ripples, entering the symbolic reservoir of human memory. This is why flood myths feel universal. They are both local and global, both specific and archetypal. They speak to an awareness shared by all humans who have watched land vanish and water rise. And perhaps that is the final truth of Doggerland. It is not unique, but emblematic, one among many drowned worlds that remind us of impermanence. Its silence is louder because we can measure it, because science has restored its contours. But its meaning lies in what it represents: the fragility of human life before nature, the impermanence of geography, the inevitability of forgetting. Doggerland is not only Europe's lost land, it is a symbol of all the worlds that have vanished, and of all the worlds still to be lost. To stand on the shores of the North Sea and look outward is to look across a graveyard without markers. Beneath those waves lie forests, rivers, and lives erased. The sea conceals, but it also reveals, offering fragments that remind us that silence itself is a form of memory. Doggerland lingers not in chronicles, but in absence, not in monuments, but in myth. And in that lingering absence lies its power. It reminds us that what we think of as solid, permanent, enduring, is always provisional, always one tide away from being erased. Doggerland is gone, yet it is with us still, in myths reshaped, in fragments recovered, in questions left unanswered. And in its silence, it forces us to ask what else lies drowned and forgotten, what else will be erased, and how much of ourselves will one day be remembered only as whispers beneath the sea. The drowned plain of Doggerland, though invisible beneath the waves, continues to disturb the boundaries of how we understand history itself. For in its vanishing lies a truth that cuts through every age, that the past is never secure, and that memory is always at risk of erasure. What troubles most is not only that Doggerland was lost, but that it was lost twice. First to the sea, and then to human forgetting. Millennia of silence stretched over its valleys and forests, while myths of drowned kingdoms arose elsewhere, detached from the geography that had inspired them. This double disappearance, physical and cultural, creates the deepest wound. To contemplate Doggerland is to peer into a fracture in human time. Here was a land that thrived for thousands of years, rich with rivers and plains, forests and marshes. Families hunted, fished, and gathered in a landscape as alive as any known to us today. Their lives were full of meaning, bound to the cycles of seasons and the rhythms of rivers. And then, with the advance of waters and the violence of floods, all of it was undone. Not simply homes, not simply villages, but entire ways of being dissolved. What lingers now are fragments without context, tools that once belonged to hands we cannot name, bones that once bore flesh, traces of pollen from trees that no longer stand. The lives behind them are shadows we cannot follow. It is this silence that gives Doggerland its peculiar power. Other lost civilizations left ruins to remind us. We can walk the streets of Pompeii. We can climb the stones of Machu Picchu. We can decipher the glyphs of Egypt and Mesopotamia. But Doggerland offers no such anchor. It cannot be walked, cannot be touched, cannot be reconstructed in its entirety. It exists only as absence, as ghostly outline on sonar scans, as sediment cores pulled from the seabed. In this absence, imagination takes root. The mind begins to fill the void, to picture rivers flowing where there are now waves, to hear voices where there is only silence. Doggerland becomes less a place than a symbol, a reminder of all that history cannot preserve. The fragments that break through the silence strike with a peculiar intensity. Consider the polished flint microliths, shaped with delicate precision. They are not clumsy improvisations, but the products of knowledge honed across generations. Consider the harpoons carved from deer antler, smoothed by hands now dust. They speak of hunters who knew the rivers intimately, who understood the patience required to survive. Consider the bones of mammoths and aurochs, dredged from nets centuries after the creatures themselves vanished. These objects are not only material evidence, they are echoes of worlds. Each one is a reminder that Doggerland was real, inhabited, alive. And yet, because they are fragments, they remind us equally of what has been lost. The Starega slide remains the most dramatic chapter in this loss. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off Norway triggered a tsunami that raced across the North Atlantic. For Doggerland's low plains, this surge was catastrophic. Waves swallowed villages, tore through forests, erased the fragile stability of lives already pressed by rising seas. Survivors would have fled inland, but the trauma of such an event would linger. It is not hard to imagine that the memory of this flood became legend, told and retold until it was woven into myths of drowned kingdoms and wrathful seas. Yet without writing, these stories dissolved into archetypes, unmoored from their geography. The land itself disappeared, and the stories that might have preserved its name floated away, leaving only echoes in folklore. Modern rediscovery has brought Doggerland back into view, but in a way that deepens rather than resolves its mystery. Seismic scans reveal river channels and ancient ridges, showing us the shape of a lost land in digital form. Archaeologists reconstruct environments, mapping forests and marshes long submerged. Yet what emerges is ghostly. These reconstructions are not the land itself, but its outline. They tell us where rivers once flowed, but not the songs sung along their banks. They show us where forests grew, but not the beliefs tied to their trees. Science restores Doggerland's geography, but it cannot restore its soul. That gap between knowledge and meaning remains unbridgeable, and it is precisely there that Doggerland unsettles us. The absence also complicates the way we understand Europe. The neat story of Britain as an island, eternally apart from the continent, collapses when Doggerland is remembered. For thousands of years, Britain was not an island at all, but a peninsula joined by fertile plains to the continent. The waters that now divide were once a unifying landscape. Later, histories built upon separation, upon the illusion of natural borders, were therefore constructed on forgetting. To recall Doggerland is to destabilize those narratives, to acknowledge that the divisions we take for granted are temporary, contingent, born of catastrophe. It is a reminder that what we think of as eternal geography is only a fragile arrangement of land and sea. But perhaps the most haunting lesson of Doggerland is not about the past at all, but about the present. For as seas rise again in our own age, Doggerland becomes prophecy. It tells us that cities can drown, coastlines can shift, entire homelands can vanish. The people of Doggerland must have believed their rivers eternal, their forests enduring, their plains unshakable. We too believe in permanence, in cities of steel and concrete that seem immovable. Yet Doggerland whispers otherwise. It reminds us that permanence is illusion, that water is patient, that erasure is always possible. The silence beneath the North Sea is a warning as much as a memory. To face Doggerland is to face humility. We cannot recover its full story, nor can we prevent the sea from rising again. What we can do is listen to the fragments, to the silence, to the echoes of myths that carry its trauma. We can acknowledge that history is as much about loss as it is about preservation. We can accept that forgetting is part of the human condition, and that what is remembered is only ever a fraction of what has been lived. Doggerland teaches us that the true shape of history is not a continuous line, but a broken one, filled with gaps and silences as vast as the North Sea itself. And so the drowned land remains, patient and voiceless, concealed beneath gray waters. It is both nowhere and everywhere, a ghost in Europe's memory, a mirror for our own impermanence. It offers no closure, no resolution, only questions. What lives were lost to its floods? What stories were never told again? What knowledge slipped away with the rising tide? These questions linger like the sound of waves crashing on unseen shores. Doggerland does not answer them. It cannot. It only leaves us with silence, and in that silence the unsettling truth that one day our own lands may join it, swallowed by the same indifferent sea. The silence that surrounds Doggerland is not empty. It is layered, textured, almost suffocating in its weight. For beneath the waves of the North Sea lies not only a drowned plain, but a history erased twice over, once by water and once by human forgetting. In that double absence, Doggerland becomes something more than prehistory. It becomes a riddle about what it means to lose not just land but memory, not just lives, but the continuity of meaning. It stands as both a fact of geology and a metaphor of history, forcing us to confront the fragility of our narratives. Imagine again the scale of this loss. Doggerland stretched from the eastern coast of Britain to the lowlands of Denmark and the Netherlands. It was larger than many modern nations, a place of rivers, lakes, forests, and marshes where people thrived for thousands of years. To its inhabitants, this was not a periphery, but the center of their world. They hunted red deer, aurochs, and wild boar. They fished in rivers that now lie hidden beneath salt water. They raised children who learned to shape flint with precision and carve harpoons from antler. And then, across centuries, the sea crept closer. Marshes formed where meadows had been, rivers widened into estuaries, and coastlines dissolved into water. At last, with floods and the Storegga tsunami, the land was gone. Yet when we look into the cultural record of Europe, we find almost nothing of Doggerland. Myths of drowned kingdoms appear elsewhere: Lyonesse in Cornwall, Cantre'r Gwaelod in Wales, Ceres in Brittany. But Doggerland itself is not named. Why? Perhaps its memory was scattered and transformed into symbols that outlived their geography. Perhaps its people, scattered across new lands, carried fragments of story that were absorbed into other myths, altered until the place itself dissolved into allegory. But perhaps the deeper truth is that Doggerland was erased by silence that served later identities. Britain as an island, Europe as a continent, division as destiny. All of this depended on forgetting the land that once joined them. Doggerland contradicted the story. Its absence made separation easier to imagine as eternal. This is why the rediscovery of Doggerland feels less like archaeology and more like revelation. When seismic scans revealed drowned river channels beneath the North Sea, when trawlers dredged up bones of mammoths and tools shaped by human hands, the world was forced to remember what it had forgotten. Doggerland was not myth. It was fact. And in that fact lay discomfort. For to remember Doggerland is to remember that seas rise, that maps are not fixed, that even continents shift and fracture. It is to accept that permanence is a story, not a reality. The fragments themselves carry an uncanny presence. A polished flint blade glimmers not only with function, but with the ghost of its maker's intention. A harpoon carved from antler speaks not only of hunting, but of ritual, of knowledge passed through generations. The bones of aurochs and red deer hint at abundance, but they also remind us of change, for many of the great animals of Doggerland vanished as its lands shrank. Each object is both evidence and elegy, a fragment that proves existence while underscoring erasure. They are the bones of a world that cannot return. Doggerland's silence is therefore not accidental. It is instructive. It shows us that history is not only what survives, but what is lost. We often define civilizations by what they leave behind: ruins, monuments, chronicles. But Doggerland teaches us to measure history also by absence, by gaps, by silences that press upon the imagination. It reminds us that the majority of human life, across millennia, has left no enduring record. For every Pompeii preserved in ash, there are countless Doggerlands erased by water. History is not a continuous line, but a patchwork of fragments separated by vast seas of forgetting. This truth becomes more urgent when placed against our own time. For as seas rise once again, the fate of Doggerland no longer feels distant. Cities built along coasts, London, New York, Shanghai, Jakarta, are as vulnerable to tides as the marsh villages of Doggerland once were. To study that drowned plain is to glimpse our own future. The people of Doggerland must have believed, at least for a time, that the land would endure. They could not have imagined their rivers buried beneath waves. We too believe in the permanence of our cities, our coastlines, our nations. Doggerland whispers otherwise. It tells us that no land is eternal, that every horizon is fragile, that water will one day reclaim even what feels immovable. And here lies the deepest haunting of Doggerland, the recognition that forgetting may be our fate as well. If Doggerland could vanish so thoroughly that only sonar and sediment recall it, what of us? What fragments will remain when our cities are gone? A shard of glass, a rusted beam, a fossilized remnant of concrete. These may be our flint blades, our antler harpoons. Future archaeologists may hold them and wonder at lives they cannot fully reconstruct. Our myths may dissolve as Doggerland's did, leaving only archetypes, only stories of drowned worlds retold in altered forms. Our names may vanish as completely as Doggerland's did, remembered only as silence beneath the sea. And yet there is a strange beauty in this silence. Doggerland reminds us that what is erased still shapes what survives. Its absence created the geography we know, the division between Britain and Europe, the myths of separation that shaped nations and empires. Silence is not emptiness but force. What is forgotten still exerts influence, still defines what comes after. Doggerland, in its voicelessness, has shaped us more than many lands that remain above water. Its drowning is part of our story, whether we remember it or not. To stand at the edge of the North Sea is to feel this presence pressing against the horizon. The waves conceal valleys where rivers once flowed, plains where fires once burned, marshes where voices once rose in song. The sea erases, but it also preserves, holding fragments in its depths like secrets waiting to surface. And those fragments, when they emerge, compel us to listen not only to what they reveal, but to what they withhold. For Doggerland is not only a land lost to water, it is a land that teaches us to dwell within silence, to accept that absence is part of history's truth. In the end, Doggerland does not return answers. It offers questions, haunting, insistent, unresolved. What was believed before the waters rose? What songs were sung in its forests? What rituals were performed as graves disappeared beneath tides? What myths were first born from its trauma? These questions cannot be resolved, only carried, as we carry the silence itself. And perhaps this is Doggerland's final lesson, that to remember is not always to know, and that history is as much about the shadows it leaves as the light it preserves. Beneath the restless waters of the North Sea, Doggerland endures in silence, lost but never gone, drowned but still shaping us. It is both past and prophecy, both wound and mirror. And in its haunting absence, we find the most unsettling truth, that our own permanence is only another story waiting to be drowned. Doggerland, when spoken of today, feels like a land of paradox. It is both familiar and alien, both a part of our world and entirely beyond reach. We know where it lay, how large it was, what kinds of animals roamed its plains, and what kinds of tools its people crafted. Yet in all this knowledge, we find nothing of their voices, their myths, their inner lives. What remains is a continent of silence, outlined by sonar but inaccessible to memory. It is this paradox that gives Doggerland its uncanny power. We know enough to be haunted, but never enough to be satisfied. The fragments that reach us from the seabed act as messengers, carrying hints of a drowned life. A fragment of red deer antler carved into a harpoon, dredged from silt, tells us of hunters who stood on the banks of rivers that no longer flow. A microlith of flint, small and sharp, speaks of patience, of generations learning to craft with precision. The bones of wild cattle and horse suggest a world of abundance, an ecosystem now erased. Yet these objects do not tell us how the people of Doggerland thought about their place in the world. They do not tell us how they interpreted the encroaching waters, whether as natural inevitability, as punishment, or as mystery. The artifacts are eloquent in their silence, proof of existence, but not of meaning. It is the question of meaning that lingers most. For to live in Doggerland was to live in a world where the ground itself was vanishing. Imagine standing on a shore that had once been inland meadow, watching the sea claim it inch by inch. Each season the water crept closer. Marshes spread across once stable ground, estuaries widened, familiar hunting paths disappeared. This was not a sudden apocalypse, but a long unraveling. And yet, even as the horizon advanced, life continued. Families built hearths, hunters prepared their spears, rituals were performed for the cycles of birth and death. What does it mean to live fully in a place one knows is vanishing? That is Doggerland's most haunting question, and it is one that mirrors our own time. For the waters did not merely rise slowly, they also struck with violence. The Storegga Slide tsunami, unleashed by a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, surged into Doggerland, with waves towering 30 meters high. Villages and forests were obliterated in moments. Those who survived must have carried that terror with them into exile, speaking of waves that rose like mountains and swallowed the land. Perhaps in the retelling, the flood became myth, stripped of geography but preserved in symbol. Perhaps that is why flood stories haunt Europe's folklore. The drowned kingdoms of Cantre'r Gwaelod, the sunken city of Ceres, the lost land of Lyonesse. None of these name Doggerland, yet all resonate with its fate. Trauma becomes story, story becomes legend, legend becomes silence. The silence is not passive, it is active, shaping how we remember and how we forget. Later histories of Europe built themselves on the illusion of natural borders. Britain became an island in both geography and imagination, defined as separate, destined to be distinct. Yet Doggerland reminds us that this separation was not eternal, that it was born of disaster. For thousands of years, Britain and Europe were joined, unified by fertile plains. The sea's advance created not destiny, but division, and the forgetting of Doggerland allowed that division to harden into myth. To recall Doggerland is to recall unity erased, a geography of connection hidden beneath waves. Perhaps that is why its memory was allowed to vanish. It did not serve the stories later cultures wished to tell. And yet, Doggerland cannot be fully erased. Science has restored its outline, and fragments continue to surface. The bones of mammoths and aurochs, lifted by fishermen from dark waters, remind us that land once lay there. Seismic surveys trace drowned valleys, reconstructing rivers as clearly as if they still flowed. Archaeologists map its forests and marshes, imagining the habitats that once flourished. Each discovery cracks the silence a little more, but never fully. For Doggerland remains inaccessible, concealed beneath restless tides, unreachable to footsteps. It is a presence that can be known only in absence. This paradox extends into the way Doggerland haunts our imagination of the future. For as seas rise once again, the fate of Doggerland feels less like distant prehistory and more like prophecy. Coastal cities today stand where the people of Doggerland once stood, believing the ground beneath them secure. Yet Venice sinks, New Orleans floods, islands in the Pacific vanish under rising tides. Doggerland whispers that permanence is illusion, that the sea is always patient, that one day our cities too may lie beneath waves. What fragments will we leave behind? Shards of glass, twisted steel, fossilized concrete. These may become the flint blades and antler harpoons of our drowned age, fragments held by future hands trying to reconstruct a world erased. And so Doggerland becomes more than a lost land. It becomes a mirror. It reflects back at us the fragility we prefer to ignore, the impermanence we dress in monuments and maps. It shows us that silence is not emptiness, but a force that shapes identity, that forgetting is as much a part of history as remembering. In its absence, we are reminded that every civilization stands on thresholds, that every permanence is provisional, that the sea waits always at the edge of our world. The haunting of Doggerland lies in its refusal to resolve. It does not offer closure, it offers fragments, questions, silence. What rituals did its people perform as waters rose? What stories did they tell their children about the land that was vanishing? What words did they use for the sea that advanced inexorably, season after season? These questions hang unanswered, suspended like mist above the North Sea. To look into Doggerland is to accept that not all mysteries can be solved, that absence itself can be truth. Perhaps that is its final gift, humility. Doggerland humbles us, reminding us that we too may be forgotten, that our monuments may dissolve, our names vanish, our lands drown. It reminds us that history is never whole, that silence is as much its substance as memory. And in that reminder, there is both grief and beauty, the grief of erasure, the beauty of understanding that all permanence is fleeting. Doggerland remains beneath the waves, unseen but present, a ghost continent whose silence is louder than words. It waits, patient, reminding us that loss is not the end but part of the story. It is not only Europe's Atlantis, it is a mirror for all of humanity. And in its drowning, it leaves us with the most haunting of questions. When the tide rises again, what will remain of us, and who will remember the land we called our own? To dwell on Doggerland is to dwell on the fragile threshold between presence and absence, between what is remembered and what is lost. For here lies a land that was once alive with rivers and forests, with marshes and meadows, with human footsteps pressed into soil that no longer exists. It was as real as any modern country, yet now it lingers only as outline, only as fragments dredged from the sea. This in-between state, half known, half unknowable, is what makes Doggerland so haunting. It is not myth, not invention, but neither is it recoverable. It exists as a ghost continent, a reminder of how easily even vast worlds can vanish. What troubles most is the scale of the forgetting. Doggerland was not a small island swallowed in a storm. It was a continent-sized plain, larger than many nations of Europe today. For millennia, it sustained communities, hosted migrations, and formed the very bridge that joined Britain to Europe. Yet it was erased so thoroughly that its name, its stories, its memory disappeared. Only in the last century did science reanimate its outline through sonar and sediment, restoring to us what human memory had discarded. That absence of memory is as striking as the loss of land itself. It suggests that history is not only fragile but selective, that what survives is what fits later narratives, and what does not is consigned to silence. The fragments that surface from beneath the sea strike like messages from another world. A flint arrowhead, sharp-edged and deliberate, tells us of hands that knew the art of shaping stone. A harpoon carved from antler, smooth from labor, speaks of rivers once rich with fish. The bones of mammoth and aurochs remind us that this was a place of abundance, a land where great beasts roamed and humans followed. And yet, each fragment is only a partial truth. They cannot tell us the rituals of mourning, the songs sung at night, the words spoken as waters rose. They cannot tell us how people made sense of the land that was vanishing beneath their feet. They are fragments of survival, but not fragments of meaning. Perhaps it is here that myth begins. For when memory cannot preserve detail, it transforms experience into symbol. The people of Doggerland must have told stories of waters advancing, of land shrinking, of floods that came like beasts from the sea. These stories, carried into exile as survivors fled to higher ground, may have become the archetypes of flood myths across Europe. In Wales, the legend of Contre'r Gwaelod recalls a kingdom drowned when walls failed. In Cornwall, Lyoness is said to lie beneath the waves, its bells still tolling from under the sea. In Brittany, the city of Kyrgyz was swallowed by water, punished for its decadence. None of these tales name Doggerland, but all echo with its trauma. The drowned land may have dissolved into legend, its geography forgotten, but its loss preserved in symbol. The Starega Slide tsunami is often invoked as the final blow, a catastrophe that transformed long erosion into sudden violence. A submarine landslide off Norway unleashed waves that surged across the North Sea, overwhelming Doggerland's low plains. To witness such an event would have been to see the world itself turn against you, villages torn apart, forests flattened, people swept into waters with no return. Such a memory could not be erased in a single generation. It would be carried in whispers, in cautionary tales, in ritual warnings. Over centuries, stripped of detail but charged with fear, those memories may have merged into myths of divine wrath and drowned realms. Thus, Doggerland lives on not in chronicles, but in the symbolic imagination of Europe. And yet, it is not only myth that makes Doggerland endure. It is also prophecy. For as seas rise again in our own age, the fate of Doggerland feels less like distant prehistory and more like mirror. Coastal cities around the world now face what Doggerland's people once faced: creeping waters that turn meadows to marsh, storms that erase shorelines, floods that redraw maps. Venice sinks, Jakarta drowns, New York braces against tides. Doggerland whispers to us that permanence is illusion, that no city, however grand, is immune. What we see as eternal may one day lie beneath waves, leaving only fragments for others to find. In Doggerland's silence, we hear not only the past, but our own future. The rediscovery of Doggerland by modern science has unsettled the way we see Europe. Britain as an island is a central myth of its identity, but Doggerland reveals that for thousands of years it was not an island at all, but a peninsula of Europe. The waters that now divide once unified, and the division we take for granted was born of catastrophe. To recall Doggerland is to destabilize those identities, to see that borders are temporary, that geography is contingent. The myth of eternal separation collapses when faced with the truth of drowned unity. Perhaps that is why Doggerland remained forgotten for so long. It contradicted the stories nations wanted to tell. Its silence was useful, its absence convenient. Yet fragments continue to break through that silence. Bones dredged from the sea, tools recovered from nets, seismic maps revealing rivers beneath waves. All these insist on memory. They remind us that forgetting is never complete, that the past always returns in pieces. Doggerland is a dialogue between silence and fragments, between erasure and persistence. It tells us that history is not fixed but unstable, shaped as much by what is lost as by what is preserved. To study Doggerland is to confront the truth that our understanding of the past will always be incomplete, fractured, provisional. Perhaps this is why Doggerland resonates so deeply. It reveals that absence itself is a kind of presence. The drowned land is not gone. It shapes Europe's geography, its myths, its sense of identity. Its silence is a force, pressing upon the imagination, compelling us to ask what else has been lost. For if a continent-sized plain can vanish so thoroughly, what of other lands, other stories, other civilizations? How much of human history has already slipped beneath water, sand, or silence, leaving no trace? Doggerland becomes emblem of all the worlds that have vanished, a reminder that what we know is only a fraction of what has been lived. In the end, Doggerland teaches humility. It shows us that memory is fragile, that permanence is illusion, that silence is as much a part of history as stone and text. Beneath the waves of the North Sea lies a land that was once alive with forests, rivers, and voices, now reduced to fragments and questions. Its silence is unsettling, but also necessary. It reminds us that loss is not anomaly, but essence, that history is not complete record, but broken story, and so Doggerland endures, patient and voiceless, hidden yet present. It is both absence and presence, both warning and memory. It does not tell us answers, only leaves us with questions. What was believed when the waters rose? What was mourned when the plains were lost? What will remain of us when our own lands drown? These questions drift like echoes across the sea, unanswered, insistent, eternal. Doggerland doesn't vanish in silence. It speaks through silence, and in listening, we hear not only its story, but our own. The silence of Doggerland is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with shadows, with echoes of footsteps on plains that no longer exist, with the memory of rivers flowing where now only waves roll. When we look into the North Sea, we do not see absence, we see concealment. Beneath that restless surface lie the outlines of valleys, the beds of rivers, the roots of forests buried in peat. The land is gone, but the earth remembers. Every sonar scan, every fragment of bone dredged from the depths is a reminder that the sea is not only a barrier, but a vault, a keeper of forgotten worlds. Doggerland lives on, not in the open air, but in this concealed archive where time holds its secrets tightly. The haunting truth is that Doggerland's erasure did not happen all at once. For generations, people would have witnessed its slow unraveling. What had been stable hunting grounds became wetlands. Marshes expanded where children once played. Each year the shoreline retreated further inland. Each year families moved their hearths higher. The sea advanced not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a creeping inevitability. To live in Doggerland was to live in the shadow of vanishing ground, to measure life not in permanence but in retreat. Such knowledge must have carved itself deep into the psyche of its people. Perhaps it was here that humanity first truly learned the fragility of land, the impermanence of home. And then, when the sea had already claimed much, came violence. The Storegga Slide, that submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, unleashed waves that towered like mountains. In Doggerland's low-lying marshes and estuaries, those waves would have been annihilation. Imagine it, the roar of water, the forests collapsing under its force, villages erased in minutes. Survivors, if there were any, would have fled inland in terror, their memory of the event shaping stories too immense for detail. The wave became symbol, carried across generations as a myth of punishment or fate. Its geography may have been forgotten, but its meaning endured, woven into flood legends scattered across Europe. These legends, Cantre'r Gwaelod in Wales, Lyonesse in Cornwall, Curious in Brittany, do not mention Doggerland by name, yet they resonate with its fate. They speak of lands swallowed by the sea, of bells tolling beneath the waves, of civilizations undone by flood. It is tempting to read them as echoes, to imagine that the trauma of Doggerland's drowning rippled outward, transfigured into symbols that survived when memory did not. If so, then Doggerland has not been entirely silent. It has spoken through story, though its name was lost. The myths are not history, but they are memory disguised, shadows of truth retold until the geography dissolved, but the warning remained. Yet for all its echoes, Doggerland remains unsettling because of what cannot be recovered. We can map its rivers, but not the prayers spoken along their banks. We can reconstruct its forests, but not the beliefs tied to their trees. We can recover bones, but not the gestures of love and grief that surrounded them. What is lost is not only geography, but intimacy, the sense of how it felt to live, to hope, to despair in that vanishing land. This is the silence that haunts, the silence of inner life erased, of meaning drowned beyond recovery. The rediscovery of Doggerland by modern science reopens this silence, but in fragments. Seismic surveys reveal drowned valleys with startling precision. Sediment cores pull up traces of pollen, reconstructing forests long submerged. Fishermen's nets deliver bones and tools that prove human presence. And yet, these fragments cannot form a complete world. They are pieces of a puzzle with no final image, a reconstruction always incomplete. Doggerland emerges in glimpses, ghostly, partial, insistent, but never whole. Its presence unsettles because it is always shadowed by its absence. This partial recovery forces us to confront the nature of history itself. We imagine history as continuity, a line of memory stretching back through time. But Doggerland reveals history as rupture, as silence, as vast erasure punctuated by fragments. What we know is only what survives. What is lost may be greater still. For every Doggerland rediscovered, there may be 10 others drowned and forgotten beyond recovery. The drowned plain beneath the North Sea is therefore not anomaly, but emblem, a reminder that most of human existence is already erased. And it is here that Doggerland becomes prophecy as well as memory. Rising seas today threaten coastlines across the world. The creeping waters that swallowed Doggerland now return to swallow islands in the Pacific, marshes in Louisiana, cities perched on fragile coasts. Venice, Jakarta, Miami, all stand where Doggerland's people once stood, believing their ground secure even as the sea advances. Our skyscrapers may seem more enduring than their wooden huts, but permanence is illusion. One day, perhaps, our cities too will lie drowned, leaving only fragments for others to recover. Our monuments may become the flint blades of a future archaeology, mute evidence of lives once lived. The silence of Doggerland therefore speaks to us directly. It tells us that memory is fragile, that permanence is provisional, that the sea erases not only land but meaning. It warns us that forgetting is as inevitable as flood. What was once the heart of Europe vanished so thoroughly that it had to be rediscovered millennia later by accident. If Doggerland could be lost, so can we. Its silence is not only history, it is foreshadowing. And yet there is beauty in this silence. Doggerland reminds us that absence itself has power, that what is lost still shapes what survives. Britain's identity as an island, Europe's sense of division, the myths of drowned kingdoms, all of these exist because Doggerland was erased. Its silence is not emptiness, but influence, shaping history in ways more profound than if it had endured. In this sense, Doggerland teaches us to see silence not as void, but as presence. What is forgotten still defines us. The sea above Doggerland remains restless, concealing its valleys and forests, holding its fragments in darkness. But those fragments, when they emerge, remind us that the past is not gone, only hidden. They force us to listen, not only to what can be known, but to what cannot. For Doggerland is not only a drowned land, but a drowned question, an unanswered riddle at the heart of Europe's story. and in that riddle lies its haunting power. Perhaps this is Doggerland's final lesson, that history is not about answers, but about questions that refuse resolution. To remember it is to live with silence, to accept that loss is as real as survival, that forgetting is as powerful as memory. Beneath the North Sea lies not only a vanished plain, but the truth that all civilizations, ours included, stand on fragile ground. Doggerland asks us not what was lost, but what will be lost, and how we will be remembered when our own silence begins. And so the drowned land endures, not as geography, not as memory, but as haunting presence. It waits in the dark, voiceless but insistent, pressing its silence upon us like a tide. Doggerland does not tell us its story. It compels us to confront our own. Doggerland lingers in our imagination, not only as a drowned land, but as a wound in the fabric of history. It is the reminder that even entire worlds can vanish without leaving behind more than fragments and whispers. When we peer into the restless waters of the North Sea, we are not looking at empty space but at concealment, an archive too deep to read, a library of lives erased. And it is this very erasure that presses on us like a phantom hand, unsettling the belief that history is continuity. For Doggerland is not continuity, it is rupture, and in that rupture lies its power. Consider what it meant for the people who lived there. For thousands of years, Doggerland was fertile and abundant, its rivers fed by the Thames, the Rhine, and countless smaller streams. It was not a barren bridge, but a lush corridor, a heartland where communities flourished. Children were raised, fires burned in hearths, flint was shaped into delicate blades, antlers carved into harpoons, hides stretched into shelter. The rhythm of life was steady, bound to the land as securely as we are bound to our cities today. And then, slowly, the rhythm faltered. Marshes crept in where meadows had been, rivers widened into estuaries, coastlines dissolved. Families must have marked each loss in silence, carrying grief into exile as the ground itself betrayed them. The slow advance of the sea was punctuated by terror. The Storegga Slide tsunami, triggered by a landslide off Norway's coast, surged across the basin with unimaginable violence. To witness it would have been to feel the world itself dissolve. Forests flattened, villages swept away, people pulled into waters with no return. Those who survived would have carried that memory into generations, shaping tales of punishment, of divine anger, of worlds undone. Such tales could not be contained by geography. They became archetypes, flood myths retold and reshaped until the name of Doggerland was lost, but its trauma endured. Perhaps this is why Europe's folklore is threaded with drowned kingdoms, from Contrère Gwaelod in Wales to Lyonesse in Cornwall and Carius in Brittany. The stories are not precise, but their resonance is too deep to ignore. Yet Doggerland itself was erased from memory until seismic surveys in the 20th century revealed its valleys and ridges. The shock of that discovery unsettled our sense of permanence. We had thought the sea eternal, the map fixed. To learn that an entire continent lay beneath the waves was to admit that the horizon is not truth but moment. Land can vanish, borders can dissolve. What we call geography is only temporary arrangement, not eternal fact. The rediscovery of Doggerland shattered the illusion of permanence, reminding us that our own lands, too, may be only provisional. The artifacts pulled from the sea carry this truth with a quiet dignity. A polished flint blade is not only a tool, but a fragment of memory, proof that someone once knelt in the marshes, shaping it with care. An antler harpoon is not only for hunting, but a whisper of rivers where fish once swam. The bones of aurochs and mammoths are not only evidence of environment, but echoes of awe, of lives lived in proximity to great beasts now gone. Each fragment is both presence and absence, both survival and erasure. They prove that Doggerland was real, and in the same breath remind us how little of it endures. To study Doggerland is to confront silence itself. For science can tell us the shape of its rivers, the breadth of its forests, the timing of its drowning. But it cannot tell us the stories its people told, the beliefs they held, the rituals they performed as their land dissolved. It cannot tell us how they explained the water's advance to their children, how they mourned the graves swallowed by tides, how they understood their own impermanence. This is the silence that haunts us, the silence not of facts, but of meaning. Doggerland lingers as a geography we can map, but never fully inhabit, a memory we can outline, but never restore. And in that silence lies reflection. For we too live at the edge of advancing waters. Seas rise once more, glaciers melt, storms intensify, islands in the Pacific sink, coasts erode, cities flood. To study Doggerland is not to look only into the past, but into our own future. Its people must have thought their land eternal, their rivers enduring, their forests unshakable. We too believe in permanence, in skyscrapers and coastlines immune to change. Doggerland whispers otherwise. It tells us that no land is eternal, that the sea is patient, that erasure is inevitable. Its silence is not only history, it is prophecy. This prophetic silence forces humility. For if Doggerland could vanish so completely, leaving only fragments, then what of us? What will remain of our cities when waters reclaim them? Rusted beams, shards of glass, fragments of plastic. These may be the future's flint blades and antler harpoons, fragments studied by archaeologists who will never know our names. Our myths may dissolve as Doggerland's did, leaving only archetypes of drowning, stories retold without geography. Our continuity may fracture into silence, just as theirs did. Doggerland's absence also reshapes how we view Europe. Britain as an island, eternally separate, is a myth made possible by Doggerland's drowning. For thousands of years, Britain was joined to Europe by fertile plains, the sea that now divides once united. To remember Doggerland is to remember that separation is not destiny, but disaster. Borders we take for granted are fragile, born not of eternity, but of catastrophe. In this sense, Doggerland disrupts national myths as much as it disrupts geological ones. It reminds us that identity itself can be built upon forgetting. And perhaps this is the deepest truth of Doggerland, that silence is not emptiness, but power. Its absence shaped Europe's geography. Its forgetting shaped Europe's identities. Its fragments shape our imagination. The drowned land is both nowhere and everywhere, unseen but always present in the myths, in the coastlines, in the questions it compels us to ask. What else has been erased? How much of human history has already vanished beneath water, sand, or silence? How fragile is the story we call civilization? Beneath the restless waters of the North Sea, Doggerland waits, not as ruin, but as riddle. It does not offer closure. It offers fragments, silence, and questions that echo without resolution. What was believed when the waters rose? What rituals were performed as the forests drowned? What myths were born from the terror of waves advancing without end? These questions linger like fog over the sea, insistent, unanswered. Doggerland teaches us that history is not a line, but a broken horizon, fractured by floods, fractured by forgetting. It teaches us that permanence is myth, that silence is as much a part of history as stone and text. And in this haunting silence, we are forced to confront ourselves, our own fragility, our own future of rising seas, our own inevitable silence. The drowned land beneath the North Sea endures in absence, shaping us through what it withholds. Doggerland does not speak in words, but in silence, and in listening to that silence we hear not only its story, but our own. Doggerland continues to haunt the imagination, not because of what we know, but because of what we cannot know. It is a geography suspended between certainty and absence, a land whose outline has been restored through science, yet whose meaning remains submerged. The valleys, rivers, and forests mapped beneath the North Sea tell us that it was real, that people lived there, that lives unfolded with as much complexity as our own. But the silence that surrounds those lives, the beliefs, the fears, the rituals, remains absolute. This silence is not accidental. It is the essence of Doggerland. It is what makes the drowned plain more than history. It makes it a riddle. In this riddle lies the realization that forgetting is as fundamental to history as remembering. For millennia, Doggerland was central, not marginal. It was a bridge that linked Britain to the continent, a fertile plain where rivers carried life across open ground. Its people hunted red deer and aurochs, fished in estuaries alive with sturgeon and eel, gathered plants that grew thick in its marshes. They shaped flint into blades of startling delicacy, carved harpoons from antler with practiced skill. They raised families in huts that stood where only water now lies. And then, with the creeping advance of the sea, all of it unraveled. The land drowned, and with it drowned the memory of its name. No legend recalls Doggerland directly. No ancient text preserves its story. It was erased not only by water, but by silence. The fragments we recover are poignant because they resist this silence without defeating it. A flint blade speaks of hands that shaped it, but not of the words those hands spoke. A harpoon carved from bone speaks of rivers now gone, but not of the rituals performed beside them. The bones of mammoths and aurochs tell us of abundance, but not of awe. Each artifact is both presence and absence, proof and erasure. They show us that Doggerland was real, and in the same breath remind us how little of it can ever be restored. It is tempting to imagine the people of Doggerland only in terms of survival, tracking herds, catching fish, building shelters. But survival alone is never the full measure of human life. They must have told stories beside their fires, sung songs in the dark, buried their dead with gestures of reverence. They must have marked the seasons, created symbols, asked questions of the stars. These intangible lives, rich and layered, are what the sea has erased. The fragments we hold today are silent about the inner world of Doggerland's people, and it is that silence that makes their absence so haunting. The tsunami triggered by the Storegga slide around 800 years ago is often remembered as the catastrophic end. Waves surged across the basin, erasing forests and villages in a single day. Survivors must have carried that trauma with them, telling stories of waters that rose like mountains, of land swallowed in an instant. In time, such stories would become myth, detached from geography, reshaped into symbols. The drowned kingdom of Cantref Gwaelod in Wales, the sunken city of Caris in Brittany, the vanished land of Lyonesse in Cornwall. Each carries the theme of sudden drowning, of worlds undone by flood. None of them mention Doggerland by name, yet each resonates with its fate. Trauma becomes story, story becomes archetype, archetype becomes silence. What unsettles most is that Doggerland's absence was convenient. Later histories depended on the idea of separation. Britain as an island, distinct and destined to be apart from Europe. Europe as a continent defined by its coasts and seas. Doggerland contradicted that narrative. It revealed unity before division, connection before separation. Its drowning allowed new myths to harden into identity, myths of natural borders and eternal boundaries. To remember Doggerland would have been to remember that division is not destiny, that borders are fragile, that the sea is not a permanent line but a shifting presence. Its silence, therefore, was not only natural, it was functional. Forgetting made later stories easier to tell. Yet silence is never complete. Science has forced Doggerland back into memory, revealing its rivers through seismic scans, its forests through pollen analysis, its people through fragments of bone and tool. It has become impossible to deny that beneath the North Sea lies not emptiness, but a drowned world. And this revelation unsettles not only our understanding of the past, but of the present. For if Doggerland could vanish so thoroughly, what of us? If entire landscapes can drown and be forgotten, what does that mean for the permanence we take for granted? Doggerland's silence whispers that our cities, too, may one day lie beneath waves, their memory erased, their names forgotten. The parallels are too sharp to ignore. Seas are rising once more. Islands vanish in the Pacific. Coastal cities face storms and floods with growing dread. We, like the people of Doggerland, live with creeping inevitability. We build defenses, shift our boundaries, tell ourselves that permanence is possible. But Doggerland whispers otherwise. It tells us that the sea is patient, that permanence is an illusion, that erasure is always possible. Its silence is not only memory, but prophecy. And perhaps this is why Doggerland resonates so deeply. It is not only prehistory, it is mirror. The people who watched their land vanish beneath rising seas are not remote. They are us. Their silence foreshadows our own. Their forgotten world warns us of our future. If Doggerland could be erased so completely that even its name vanished, then what will remain of our cities when waters reclaim them? A shard of glass, a rusted girder, a fossilized trace of concrete. These may be the fragments of our Doggerland, studied millennia from now by people who will never know our names. In this way, Doggerland forces us to reconsider what history means. It teaches us that history is not only the record of what endures, but also the silence of what is erased. It is as much about forgetting as remembering, as much about absence as presence. Beneath the North Sea lies proof that civilizations can vanish without monument, without legend, without trace. And in that proof lies a truth both humbling and terrifying, that our own continuity is no more secure than theirs was. Doggerland endures, not as place, but as silence, not as memory, but as warning. Its drowned valleys whisper that permanence is myth, that the sea is always waiting, that forgetting is inevitable. It asks us not only to wonder what was lost, but to ask what will be lost of us. The drowned land beneath the North Sea does not answer these questions. It leaves them suspended, like waves that rise and fall without resolution. And in that suspension lies its haunting power, For Doggerland is not only a story of what was, but of what will be. Its silence is our silence, its erasure our prophecy. To look into its absence is to see ourselves reflected, fragile before the sea, temporary before time. Doggerland remains in silence, pressing against the imagination like a tide. It offers no resolution, only questions. What was sung beside its rivers? What was believed as its forests drowned? What will remain of us when the sea rises again? These questions linger like fog across the water. Persistent, unanswerable, eternal. Doggerland ends not with answers, but with silence, and it is this silence that defines its haunting presence in our imagination. Beneath the North Sea lies not only a lost landscape, but a reminder that history is more fragile than we admit. The rivers that once ran through Doggerland no longer flow. The forests that once stretched across its plains no longer stand. The hearths where fires once burned are long extinguished. Yet the silence that conceals them is not emptiness. It is fullness, a density of absence that presses against us like the weight of water itself. It is tempting to think of Doggerland as anomaly, as a single drowned land among many. But the truth is more unsettling. It is emblem, not exception. All coastlines shift, all lands change, all civilizations are temporary. Doggerland simply shows us this truth in its starkest form. It was vast, fertile, central to the lives of countless generations, and still it vanished. Its story reveals that no amount of continuity, no scale of abundance can guard against the inevitability of change. The lesson written in its silence is that impermanence is not accident but law. The fragments we hold, flint blades, antler harpoons, bones of mammoth and aurochs, are tokens of this law. They tell us that Doggerland's people lived fully, crafting, hunting, shaping, singing, mourning. They remind us that this land was not marginal, but alive. And yet these fragments are only remnants. They prove existence while underscoring erasure. For each tool or bone we recover, there are thousands more lost forever. For each detail we reconstruct, there are whole worlds we cannot access. Myths, prayers, gestures, meanings drowned beyond recall. In this way, Doggerland is both present and absent, both tangible and unreachable. The myths of drowned kingdoms scattered across Europe echo this paradox. Cantrer Gwaelod, Caris, Lioness, all speak of lands swallowed by sea, of civilizations undone by flood. Perhaps these are echoes of Doggerland, its trauma preserved in symbolic form. Perhaps they are independent stories born of other local disasters. Either way, the resonance is striking. These tales endure because they touch on a universal human fear. The sea's power to erase, to reclaim, to turn permanence into memory. Doggerland may not be named in them, but its silence is felt in their rhythms. Its absence shaped their presence. What unsettles most is that Doggerland was not remembered directly. Atlantis, though likely a parable, endures in name and story. Doggerland, real and vast, disappeared from cultural memory entirely. Its rediscovery through science was therefore not only revelation, but rupture, forcing us to confront how much can be lost without trace. It reveals that history is selective, that forgetting is as inevitable as remembering. The silence of Doggerland is a reminder that for every story we preserve, countless others have already been erased. This erasure reshaped Europe itself. The drowning of Doggerland created the Britain we know today as an island. It created divisions that later became myths of destiny and identity, The silence surrounding its loss allowed those myths to harden, to become unquestioned. To remember Doggerland now is to destabilize those myths, to admit that the sea, not destiny, defined the map. The border between island and continent is not eternal. It is the result of catastrophe. Doggerland's silence thus shaped not only geography but politics, culture, identity itself. And it does not remain in the past. Its silence reaches into our future, for we too live on coasts that are vanishing. Rising seas creep forward as glaciers melt, as storms intensify. Cities once thought secure now confront flooding as routine. Venice floods beneath Aqua Alta. Jakarta sinks into its marshes. Miami braces against king tides. To look into Doggerland's silence is to see our reflection. Its drowned plains are not only history but prophecy, whispering that what happened once can happen again, that no land, however modern, however fortified, is immune to the sea's slow reclamation. What will remain of us when the waters rise? The people of Doggerland left flints and harpoons, bones and pollen traces. We may leave shards of plastic, fragments of steel, the fossilized imprint of concrete. Our skyscrapers may one day be as mute as their wooden huts, our maps as obsolete as theirs became. Archaeologists of the future may dredge fragments of our world and wonder what stories we told, what beliefs we held, what rituals we performed as waters advanced. Our memory, too, may dissolve into myth, preserved only as archetype, detached from geography. Our names may vanish into silence as Doggerland's did. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of Doggerland, that permanence is illusion. We dress our world in monuments, maps, borders, names, believing they will endure. But the sea waits patiently, reminding us that everything built on land is provisional. Doggerland is proof. It shows us that entire continents can vanish, that memory itself can be erased, that silence is the final keeper of history. To remember Doggerland is to remember our own impermanence. Yet there is also strange beauty in this. For Doggerland reminds us that loss, too, has power. Its silence is not emptiness, but presence, shaping us through what it withholds. The absence of Doggerland made Europe as we know it. Its forgetting allowed myths of separation to flourish. Its rediscovery reminds us of fragility, of humility, of the need to listen not only to what is remembered, but to what is erased. In this way, Doggerland is not gone. It endures in influence, in silence, in haunting presence. To stand on the shore of the North Sea and gaze outward is to face this truth directly. The waves conceal valleys where rivers once ran, plains where children once played, marshes where hunters once cast their spears. Beneath those waters lies a world erased, yet not gone. It waits in darkness, patient, voiceless, shaping us through its absence. Doggerland doesn't return answers. It leaves us with questions, with unease, with recognition. And perhaps that is its final gift, to teach us that history is not wholeness but fracture, not continuity but silence. To remind us that what we call permanence is fragile, that what we call memory is selective, that forgetting is as real as remembering. Doggerland endures in silence, pressing against our imagination like a tide. And in that silence, we hear the most unsettling truth of all, that one day our own world may join it, drowned and forgotten, remembered only in fragments, its story written in silence beneath the waves.